Hey folks, Guillotine here. If you're watching this, then I'm already dead. No, not really. After compiling all my chopping block reviews from 2023, I decided to go back and compile every single other chopping block review I did pre-2023, because it was only in 2022 that I started taking my video making slightly more seriously, so I wouldn't have had enough reviews to be substantive if I were to split them up into individual years since I started doing this. It's the same format as last time though. I took every single review I did from 2022 and earlier, and ranked them by how I thought of them from worst to best. If you like this more long-form stuff, then let me know. And as always, enjoy. This week I've been playing Temtem. Actually, saying I spent a week is far too charitable. I initially spent an afternoon trying out Temtem, and just in that short amount of time I was inclined to believe that it was something that I did not want to touch with a 10-foot pole. Well, that might be a bit harsh, so let's backtrack a little. In concept, it seemed rather promising, but any idea is promising until it's actually executed. That idea being Pokemon, but an MMO. Like I said, in concept, not a terrible idea, until we realized that Pokemon Sword and Shield already dabbled with minor MMO elements, as in portions of an open world being communal and being able to run into other players, along with the ability to interact, battle, and trade with almost anyone. Temtem extends that into the entirety of the map, and as far as I'm concerned, it is absolutely devastating to the notion of immersion from a narrative standpoint. For me, nothing kills the sensation of you wandering as a lone traveler going into a broad world like exiting your starting house and seeing 20 random jack-offs exiting the exact same point. That point theoretically being your childhood home. This is why I also have difficulty getting into MMOs in general. It is incredibly difficult to make a world that will meaningfully react or adjust to the player when it has to accommodate hundreds, if not thousands of other simultaneous players. It's one of several reasons that I personally don't take to MMOs, not that I'm lacking in any effort of attempts. World of Warcraft, Star Wars The Old Republic, The Elder Scrolls Online, and Fallout 76, well after it was patched to acceptability by the way, have all been dalliances that I dove into at one point or another, and I eventually got bored every time due to a lack of immersion or willingness to indulge in the story, which attempted to inflate my importance when I could simply look around and see at least 5 other individuals in my exact same state of story progression. Granted, sticking to the Pokemon formula doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the most earth-shattering of stories, but it can at least facilitate base-level immersion. Of course, even in the brief window of my playtime, I was already piling up nitpicks like a chimpanzee with cleaner condition OCD. For one, some, but not all of the NPCs initiate their dialogue boxes with Banjo-Kazooie-esque singular syllable grunts, and the noise made by your matron character was already grating after interacting with her for barely 2 minutes. Additionally, once I did exit my starting house, I couldn't help but feel cluttered, if not slightly claustrophobic, due to either the environmental design or the fact that I was sharing the same space with at least 50 other players. That crowding also eliminates a sense of wonder or exploration, and more gives the impression that navigating your way through the world is more akin to making your way through a queue to an amusement park ride, except in this metaphor, the entire attraction is the queue itself. This leads me to believe that, at least from my own viewpoint, a full-blown MMO integrating the Pokemon formula is at the very least an uphill battle, if not entirely incompatible. Speaking of the Pokemon formula, this game, even in my brief window, is blatantly attempting to be a Pepsi to Pokemon's Coke. However, they seemingly go out of their way to try and differentiate by using alternate terminology or item names in order to not fall afoul of misrepresenting the more popular and mainstream title it's trying to emulate. Unfortunately, this also leads to several problems, some of which are extremely hindering for someone who is thoroughly immersed in the Pokemon franchise. Having to change terminology and other aspects in order to separate leads to an overwhelming sense of the uncanny. What I mean is, it's close enough to the material that it's trying to reproduce that you could recognize it as such, but the change in terminologies just leaves you feeling uncomfortable or in the very least confused and not wanting to continue. However, I anticipated that this was going to be an issue going into it, and I wanted to give Temtem a genuine shot to try and overcome those issues of perception, or even actively combat them. I wanted to, but then I started exploring some of the menus. I was looking for a save function, not knowing at the time that the game auto-saves to the server every chance it gets. But in the process, I discovered the monetization tab and immediately thought I was done. I get that going for the live service format stipulates a certain degree of extra monetization, especially for MMOs, but once more, let's refer back to Pokemon Sword and Shield and acknowledge that the only monetization was the initial purchase price and the cost of DLC expansions if you decided to go for them. But Temtem has skins, mounts, emotes, and all sorts of other things that I could not give half of a sugar-frosted about. And really, you're charging us for mounts of creatures that you could catch in the game when otherwise it could just be a menu option, you stingy They do not equal a selling point to me and only trigger my cynicism synapses that the game is going to try and bilk me out of as much cash as it can, and given that I was already thoroughly soured on the concept of most MMOs given my previous experiences, I decided right then and there that I had established to my satisfaction that I was not going to enjoy this title. Or so I thought. After I put down the controller, I was initially looking for something else to make a double bill for, but then I allowed myself to cool down. Most of my significant gripes have been this game's MMO aspects, and while I've listed some Pokemon elemental complaints, it's mostly been tied to wording instead of mechanics. So I decided to make another round of it and try to ignore as much of the MMO stuff as possible, even though one could argue that being incredibly difficult in and of itself, considering that during the same pause, I also saw an article stating that Temtem had shot up to about 1 million players. I would have tried playing an offline option, but alas, no such option exists. So I booted up for another round to research the Pokemon side of this coin. The first thing isn't a complaint, but more a matter of preference. I can't say I really care for the creature design or really the game's art style in general. And going back to some minor complaints I had about the Pokemon side, while I spent a few segments complaining about what specific things are called, certain other aspects provided an interesting twist to the usual capture, collect, catalog combat formula that Pokemon has been perfecting for over 25 years. Firstly, every battle, provided you've got enough Temtem in your party, is a double battle, adding an interesting level of depth as a default. Additionally, your moves aren't dictated by your Pokemon being locked onto a specific number that they can have between needing to heal, but instead a stamina bar that gets depleted depending on the strength of the move you use in the midst of battle. You can technically overexert yourself by using more stamina than you have, or you can take a turn to rest and recover, and that's a compelling mechanic. Secondly, I greatly appreciate one of the story items that allows you to heal your entire team out in the field. Unfortunately, it's locked to a single use between healings at Temporiums, the new proper noun to replace Pokemon Centers. They were so close to making it so that you didn't have to worry about your team getting low and then grinding all the way back to a healing center, then going back along the route to try and get to where you had previously progressed. Another issue is a subtle pacing problem that comes from making every battle doubles. It's entirely possible for your team of creatures to wear out twice as fast, further exacerbating the issue I mentioned of having to stop what you're doing and run back to the nearest healing center. It got to a point where I was dreading any official battle on my route to the next story trigger. It was at this moment that I realized I was basically forcing myself to play, and by that point I think the opinion has pretty much solidified. I don't know if Temtem is a bad game or not, but I can certainly say that it's not my thing. Being in my 30s, I think I'm a little bit past the target demographic that the Chinese bootleg plush market is trying to absorb. For someone who's never experienced a Pokemon game, but loves MMOs and hasn't been turned off by anything I've said prior, have at it. This week, I've been playing a lot of Pokemon Unite. It's everyone's favorite cockfighting simulator turned into a MOBA. When you think about it, Pokemon has seen numerous genres. RPG, dungeon crawler, turn-based strategy, on-rail photography, racing games, pet simulators, and even a typing tutor. Now we have a free-to-play MOBA with the assistance of Tencent. I don't really share any love for them, but I'm not going to harp on that for now. Anyway, I haven't had much of a history with MOBAs. I tried League of Legends and Dota at a few points, but they were so mechanically deep with so many characters and such a toxic community that I would never get more than 5 minutes past the tutorials before I join a match and experience a nice invigorating death threat, so I've mostly stayed away. From the perspective of an individual who has tried to get into them but couldn't because of various hurdles, this seemed like an okay entry point. For the uneducated, a MOBA, or multiplayer online battle arena, has two teams of 3 to 5 players trying to advance into an enemy's territory to either score goals, destroy opponents' assets, or engage in battles to make it so that the other team can't engage in a defense. The specific goals for Pokemon Unite is to start off harvesting various wild Pokemon scattered around the map, gaining experience, and also harvesting points from each Pokemon that's knocked out. You can hold a certain number of points at a time, with the numbers getting bigger as the match goes on. As you level up, you access new moves to make it so you can have different effects in battle. You can become invulnerable for a time and then launch a dive bomb strike. You can set up walls and use attacks that push your opponents away to keep them at a distance, or you can be a defensive wall yourself and bounce enemy attacks from a certain direction. When capable to do so, you then rush to one of your enemy's checkpoints, which in this case are goals, to try and deposit the points you've harvested thus far. Score enough points in all the goals except for the ones closest to the opponent's spawn, and they'll eventually become destroyed, making it necessary for you to move farther into their territory. Throughout the match, larger wild Pokemon will appear, giving significant bonuses and incentives to take them down, such as double capture points or shields and experience for your teammates. Fairly straightforward, but the depth that makes for an engaging experience comes from how you're going to interact with the various characters, or in this case, Pokemon, and trying to formulate a working strategy to make it so you can advance without overextending and losing a battle. Again, fairly standard stuff for a MOBA from what I can tell. Matches consist of standard, ranked, or quick matches on smaller maps. It makes for some fast-hit fun if you can get into it with a decent roster of teammates. But I need to emphasize that your experience is going to be heavily reliant on your teammates. Going into a group that understands when to push, when to retreat,
when to offer support, when to flank, and any number of other scenarios will make for a far better and more fun experience than a team of drooling half-wits that charge blindly into battle. Or worse, idols. Given the heavy reliance you would have on an individual teammate, I can say from my brief stint with this game that I'm beginning to understand why MOBA communities are so toxic. With how much people are expected to carry their own weight and how much people are going to suffer at the loss of a single competent team member, I see why people react so adversely to such a scenario. Not that I'm saying that death threats, toxicity, and abuse are justified. I'm just saying I'm beginning to understand the mindset. So, on an individual basis, the biggest recommendation I can have is not to go in alone. Make sure you have at least 1 or 2 other teammates that are going to be able to carry their weight when going into matchmaking. Ideally, have 5 people, including yourself, that can communicate. But that's just the overarching gameplay assessment. There's more to dive into with this being a free-to-play game. And it's worth noting, Pokemon Unite is theoretically totally free-to-play. Initially, with all characters being unlockable over time through just playing and acquiring some of the numerous in-game currencies. There is one premium currency, because of course there is, and the other currencies extend to the various different things that can be purchased. There's other Pokemon characters you can acquire and play as with different play styles, there's costumes for those respective Pokemon, there's cosmetics for yourself, there's power-up items, and then there's upgrades for the power-up items. However, it's in these upgrades wherein lies the biggest cardinal sin of the free-to-play game: pay-to-win mechanics. These power items can give you a small but nonetheless impactful event on battles, and the way you conduct yourself during a match. For instance, I use a loadout mixture that seems to automatically heal me when I'm not in battle, boosts my special attack, and gives me health back when I hit someone with a special attack. Makes sense, right? Now you get a rather liberal amount of upgrade resources to boost the power-ups. However, if you're willing to drop about $20 on the game, you can break the balance over your knee by thoroughly upgrading any number of items to give yourself a clear mechanical advantage over other players who don't want to sink any money into it. There's also an issue of balance. At the time of writing, there is one Pokemon, Gengar, who through their power-up tree becomes near unstoppable in one-to-one engagements. It would also help if there were individual tutorials for the various Pokemon on how to use them. There are practice arenas, but that only has limited use and the mechanics aren't clearly explained with each character. Now, at the time of writing, I put in about 20 hours into this game, and I can't say that I haven't had fun at times. However, if pressed for a recommendation, while I was frequently giving it before in the hopes of finding other people to play with, after having sat down, weighing all the factors, and looked objectively at the game, its mechanics, and several of its surrounding aspects, I ultimately have to say that I would recommend people stay away from this one, especially if you're going in solo. As I said, having competent teammates goes a long way, but I've been primarily just going into random matchmaking, and the level of frustration that I've encountered has unfortunately caused me to start building up a body count of controllers. That, along with the pay-to-win mechanics as mentioned before, and I see this game as ultimately being detrimental for the gaming landscape. Otherwise, if you have friends that you want to play with and you know they can handle themselves in a MOBA, and you and your crew don't mind pay-to-win mechanics, hey, knock yourselves out. Just don't include me anymore.
This week, I've been playing Digimon Survive. I'll be honest here, I haven't really engaged with the Digimon series in any significant degree since I was in my mid-teens, which is 20 years ago at this point, and I'll kindly ask the passage of time to stop personally attacking me. Jokes aside, I initially took interest in this game from trailers I saw because it made the game look absolutely hysterical. I'm not going to actually play the live trailer because the last time I played a trailer with my Hot Wheels review, in spite of it being a clear and blatant example of fair use under copyright, Mattel decided to claim my video, and YouTube is an incompetent f***wit of a platform that will forever be obsequious to large corporations. However, based off these still images from the trailer, you may be able to understand why I thought that this Digimon game was going to be a mixture of murder mystery and dating sim. Not seriously, but I have seen stranger games published, although I'm pretty sure Bandai Namco is smart enough to not give validation to some of the stranger communities around the internet. Jab at the furry community aside, the very start of the game seemed to be paced alright by giving us a brief pretext of what was going on, and then sending us straight into the most basic battle tutorial. Unfortunately, once the battle tutorial was over, I was confronted with the fact that this game is very heavy on the dialogue. I was quickly made bored out of my skull, reading the dialogue text in about a quarter of the time that it took for the voice acting to conclude, and gathering the point of the dialogue well in advance of the game's intention. I haven't played a lot of visual novels in the past other than that one joke review, but if this is typical of the genre, then I can thoroughly conclude that it is not for me. It takes forever to establish basic points, and whoever was in charge of the writing should have sent an editor into this game with waiters while dual-wielding chainsaws. To me, Digimon was at its strongest when it leaned into its anime incarnations, and I wouldn't have minded watching anime cutscenes instead of having the false sense of interactivity by just having to press a button and look at text boxes continually scroll. However, the sheer amount of text is not my only complaint, but it's the fact that many of the characters introduced are very immersed in standard anime character tropes. The bad boy and the lovable companion to keep them in check. The doofy childhood friend. The level-headed sensible one. The quiet mysterious one that cares for their sibling. The weird sibling. After taking an hour to establish that this Digimon game is a Digimon game, we finally got into the second combat scenario, which was still heavily tutorialized, but after having almost drowned in dialogue, it was a welcome change. It was also a relief seeing more characters introduced to the game that may not have been unique writing-wise, but stylistically they were far more appealing. Or maybe I was just borderline falling asleep and was latching onto any sense of change that presented itself. The game also wasn't hurt by the fact that I found myself enjoying turn-based strategy games like Final Fantasy Tactics, Pokemon Conquest, or XCOM Enemy Unknown in the past. However, once the battles and repertoire of creatures are reintroduced, it doesn't stop the game from front-loading excessive dialogue and snail-paced story progression. What's even worse is the fact that once I got into the groove of looking forward to the battles to break up the story, every once in a while a battle would saddle me with an AI-controlled NPC in an escort mission that decided they wanted to figure out what fists and rocks tasted like, and proceeded to run into a crowd of enemies which forced me to lose the battle having to start over. Nonetheless, I plowed on and eventually came across some intrigue in the plot. Even with my limited experience in the franchise as a whole, I can tell you the basics are still adhered to in the early story. A motley crew of middle schoolers find themselves in a scenario where they've been transported to a strange yet mildly familiar world full of monsters that become your companions, and they mutually grow and get stronger both metaphorically and literally. The visual novel dialogue and exposition is also occasionally broken up with segments of minimal interaction in the form of exploration, massive quotation marks, that's little more than navigating drop-down menus or dragging an icon around the screen in order to take a picture with an in-game camera or highlight an exclamation mark over another character because interacting with that person is now the necessary step to move the plot along. Additionally, every once in a while you'll be given a choice to endear yourself to one of the characters with dialogue trees. It may have made a difference, but I was so focused on just getting through the dialogue at every instance that I could not have cared less about how highly they regarded me. Finally, I get that it's a staple of the visual novel genre, but all the while I was playing, I couldn't help but think to myself that all the visual assets repeat ad nauseum for the sake of budgetary constraint and or focus on other elements. In that sense, I get why they don't have anime cutscenes to portray the story, but it would have been a load more expedient. That being said, my rant on the story is done. In the endeavor of keeping this review spoiler-free, I'll not be touching on the plot anymore since this thing is so plot-heavy with dead weight that you could argue the necessity of earth-moving equipment to put the disc in the console. Gameplay-wise, for the turn-based strategy portions, I'm finding that it's rather difficult for that to get ruined for me. Hell, after a while at the start, it was the only thing keeping me playing. I don't claim to be a master strategist or intellectual, but I do find some enjoyment in watching the battle play out and anticipating moves and counter-moves similar to a game of chess. The game introduces deeper levels of the mechanics as you go through, including the ability to pacify and recruit certain enemies, positional, elemental, and equipment advantages, along with your ability to unlock power-ups and evolutions for your companions, and that's not even touching on the RPG progression level-up system. For me at least, this is absolutely where the bulk of my engagement with this title came from. To conclude, if you like the previously mentioned games like Final Fantasy Tactics or Pokemon Conquest, then this will check a few of your boxes. Just be aware that you'll be having to tread through waist-high linguistic runoff for upwards of a half hour just to experience a single battle at the very start, and the pace doesn't improve much from there.
This past week I've been playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, or as I first referred to it, Yu-Gi-Oh! Bagpipes. If you've seen my Legacy of the Duelist review, then you know that I have a love for the card game and anime and a hatred for their owner, Konami. Actually, if you've spent any time on my channel, then there's a good chance you know that I hate Konami. All personal feelings for that company aside, I want to give something a fair shake before I pass judgment. Now, Master Duel wasn't looking good before it was released. I'd seen next to zero marketing material, and the first I started to hear anything significant about it was after I'd learned that it had already been released, much to most everyone's surprise. Konami, after all, has a horrible track record when it comes to marketing, so I suppose I shouldn't be surprised when they stealth release something. Whatever. Master Duel released this week out of nowhere for PC and consoles. What was even more surprising was that it was free to play. I was also expecting another pay-to-play game, possibly with a physical release. Now, I'm not going to be giving an in-depth review of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game and its mechanics. I'm simply going to give an overarching statement about Yu-Gi-Oh! As a card game, what I think of it, and why that is, and it's become very present after playing this game for several hours. In my opinion, modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Sucks. Or to be more specific, playing modern Yu-Gi-Oh! At the competitive meta level sucks. Some archetypes and card combos in Yu-Gi-Oh! Have gotten so ridiculously overpowered and ornate that even a single turn can come down to literally dozens of moves with a small essay of text required in order to give an in-depth explanation of everything taking place, while the opponent sits across the table with their thumb up their butt, waiting for a chance to either have their first turn or find something to interrupt the lecture-length combo taking place in front of them. I personally find this torturous. For me, the enjoyment in Yu-Gi-Oh! Comes from making decks from cards I like and then playing them with friends for fun. How do I find cards that I like? I literally just look at the artwork and think to myself, oh, this looks cool. I want to play with this card. How supported is it? Either that or I'll find some inspiration from one of the shows to make a deck. In fact, let's refer to a quick snippet from my Legacy of the Duelist review for an example of that.
I've never taken the game all that seriously, and have literally made decks for reasons such as the fact that I can do a halfway decent Weevil Underwood impression.
Using my perfectly ultimate Great Moth, I'll finally be able to destroy that inflammatory wheeler!
In fact, I've made decks around cards like Wall Shadow, Crab Turtle, Gate Guardian, and Huge Revolution, and anyone that knows anything about modern meta Yu-Gi-Oh! Knows that all those cards are quite literally garbage tier. I am the ultimate casual, play-for-fun kind of guy. The second a game gets seriously competitive, I tune out. I tried a couple of tournaments, but I just couldn't get into it. One could argue that this is an issue with any card game that's been experiencing power creep for long enough, but then it's unsurprising considering Yu-Gi-Oh! Is about 20 years old by now. So those are my thoughts on the card game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And even with all its strengths and faults, it's fairly well represented in Master Duel. But what about everything surrounding the actual card game? Well, it almost pains me to say it, but Konami is for the most part given a game that presents well and is only moderately manipulative with its monetization for a free-to-play game. Rather than recapping on the various anime arcs like games of the past, this one is focused explicitly on the cards. In fact, the solo campaigns, when they're not teaching people how to play, inject stories into a selection of the card archetypes that exist and explains the backstory of the artwork. I have mixed feelings on this. It's a cool feature for those that would be interested in seeing the backstory behind the cards that they enjoy, but I personally could not care less and end up skipping 90% of them, mostly because I don't care about any of the archetypes featured in their solo campaigns. Before I dive in further, let me say that the tutorializing is actually fairly well done in the fact that people who are familiar with the game can skip the basic tutorials and still receive the rewards that they would have gotten had they performed them. Getting back to the individual card campaigns, they have a twofold purpose. First, to get practice with the basic mechanics of the game, but the other one, and the one that I'm of a mixed opinion of, is to teach how certain archetypes operate and how they twist the basic mechanics into ways new players might not initially think of. The main problem is that sometimes the decks you're given are of wildly varying quality, making it incredibly difficult to succeed on some specific levels. By trying to beat the scenario over and over, you will definitely get more familiar with the card's gimmick, but the frustration felt along the way is not insignificant. In fact, the amount of anger felt when trying to beat some of these levels drove me to having to reassemble my keyboard afterwards, due in part to the fact that many of the matches are skirting around closer to meta-level opponents and the problems I mentioned to that earlier. Okay, this part initially wasn't part of the script, but Konami can seriously go eat a dick with the decks that they give you in order to try and beat some of the solo campaigns. They are not equipped to be able to beat these decks on a regular basis. You have to hope that you get the best possible hand opening, and your opponent has the worst possible hand opening, and that is the only conceivable way by trial and erroring and mashing your head against the wall until you finally beat it. Once you have the ability to assemble a deck of your own, it's far less torturous because you're going to be picking something that you likely know the mechanics of and enjoy playing with. And if you can find a deck like that that's meta level, then you might be able to dive into multiplayer, which, by my guess, seems to be the ultimate intention of this game. With successes of the last few years like Hearthstone and things like Magic the Gathering jumping into the foray of digital card games as a live service, it makes sense that Yu-Gi-Oh! Would eventually follow as well. As I stated in my Legacy of the Duelist review, it makes sense for digital card games to be a slightly easier place to experiment with decks and engage in multiplayer, especially in the post-COVID world. Unfortunately for me, it also seems to be trying to push people into ranked play, which is where meta decks are going to be dominating the pool, and as I stated before, I find that experience to be rather torturous. For multiple people I've spoken to who have also started playing this game, it is quite easy to make at least 1 or 2 meta-level decks without sinking any money into the game. But beyond that, the currency from your initial playthroughs and first phase unlocks dries up very quickly. There are a lot of cards in this game to play with, over 6,000 at time of writing, and supposedly more being on the way, but to unlock all of them is going to be either very time-intensive or very expensive. And for a final subject, I want to complain about the method by which you unlock certain specific cards. Some archetypes allow you to unlock, quote, secret packs after encountering them through opening regular cards or crafting cards, which you can fortunately do if you get too many extras. However, the secret packs are only unlocked for 24 hours, and this timer is one of a couple very insidious psychological tactics I see that Konami is trying to use to exploit impulse purchases. By locking these packs behind a limited time frame, it creates a sense of fear that you're going to miss out on the ability to get those cards again, thus prompting a purchase before it goes away. Now, you can unlock secret packs multiple times, but that requires resources that you have to use after you've won them in-game. I suppose as a free-to-play game, this is somewhat expected, but I still do not appreciate it, and would have liked a more steady currency drip and just being able to grind for the ability to unlock cards in exchange for a one-time purchase. To conclude, as much as I hate Konami, I do have to say that this is not a bad iteration for their video game franchise on the card game. For a free-to-play game, and potential entry point, there are far worse options than Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. Just be prepared for frustration with the decks it gives you to learn with, bear in mind that it's going to be assaulting you with psychological tactics in order to get you to spend money, and for casual play lovers like me, the game is quickly going to wear out its welcome unless you're playing with friends.
This week I've been playing JoJo's Bizarre Adventure All-Star Battle R. As I said in my last video, I've been researching by watching the anime, which I summarized as beautiful people fighting beautifully in exorbitantly over-the-top scenarios. It starts with Joseph Joestar, a young man and his evil adopted stepbrother Dio, who turns into a vampire with global dominance as his goal, and JoJo must defeat him with the power of mystic breathing. Subsequent series follow the Joestar lineage in their multi-generation battle with Dio's influence and only gets more bat from there, with demigods, cyborg Nazis, battles to the death interrupting volcanoes, and international manhunts with brawls involving superpowered manifestations of one's soul. It's absurd in the way that only over-the-top anime can be, and while some of the animes might be fairly recent, the source material manga is much older. As such, it shouldn't be entirely surprising to learn there's a few video games over the years, which leads nicely to today's first feature. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure All-Star Battle R is effectively a high-end remake of the PlayStation 3 fighter of mostly the same name. In an appreciated effort to acknowledge the past, they re-released it because tracking down an original copy was rather stupid, with prices often exceeding $90 on a system that Sony is trying to not support anymore. Booting up the game, I'm struck with the visual flair and flamboyant style the show is known for, translated rather well into 3D graphics for this one-on-one fighter. The single-player campaign takes the form of assorted comic panels where you can choose to engage in varying difficulty, beat enough panels on a page to unlock the boss, and move on to the next page. They highlight various points and arcs of the show, and exaggerated expressions and bombastic finishers leads to a feast for the eyes. Unfortunately, that's about as far as my praise can go. Not that I'm saying that this is a bad game, I'm just out of my depth when it comes to most one-on-one fighters. In fact, let's refer to a point I made in my last video. You see, I like fighting games, but I'm terrible at them. This could probably be resolved if I were to have a regular partner to just mess around with fighting games in general, but that's besides the point. Yes, unfortunately I have to lean back on the fact that I am rather bad at fighters, and the process of becoming good at them is unfortunately slightly beyond my depth at this time, because in my general observation, most fighting games are terrible at explaining themselves or providing active feedback. In fact, the only two fighting game series that I've ever been any degree of good at are the Super Smash Bros. Games, or the Dragon Ball Z Budokai games, not including the Tenkaichi titles. Those are crap. But getting back on track, I would usually start matches by looking at skill lists and then trying to be more methodical in my playstyle and tactics, but once I got to higher difficulties that would quickly break down, and lacking any kind of feedback, I'd start randomly smashing buttons. This tactic left me with quite a few moments where I would execute a finisher that I would think to myself, whoa, that looked awesome! I wonder how the f*** I did that! My skill level made it so that I had a fair amount of difficulty beating any match that was higher than 3 out of 5 stars, so I guess Dio the Vampire is going to have to take satisfaction in his victory for today. This past week, I've been playing Little Nightmares 2. A while ago, I did a review for the first Little Nightmares and absolutely adored it in spite of a few inherent game design issues. The atmosphere was tense, the imagery was frightening, the metaphors ran rampant, and it was a pleasant surprise. So, how was the sequel? More of the same. Does that mean I like it? Now let me preempt some Little Nightmares defenders and say that I don't think the game is bad. It's just that in the context, it can't have the same impact as the first one. The original Little Nightmares for me was a pleasant surprise. Now that I had an expectation, the bar was effectively raised, but instead of escalating or improving some of these significant features that I had the first time, it pretty much stayed the same. Well, I say stayed the same, but there have been some alterations since the last one. It's just that they were all shit. In regards to unaddressed complaints, they didn't have an option to toggle grab like I would have liked in the last one. There were still several instances where I didn't necessarily have all information and experienced cheap deaths, and while I don't personally consider this a definitive negative, both titles are fairly short. But what's changed for the worse? Well, they introduced a combat mechanic. At certain portions of the game, your character can grab a pipe or a hammer and ward off some of the smaller foes. As with most good survival horror games that dabble with it, the combat is ineffective and highly risky, leaving you still feeling vulnerable. Unlike good horror, it's also mandatory. In the final stretch of the game, I also encountered some rather annoying environmental puzzles. Eventually, I overcame through trial and error, but for that to be the last thing I experienced, it definitely leaves a worse taste in your mouth than the previous entry that left you with a racing pulse and hyper-analytic mood to try and figure out what was going on. To its credit, I didn't walk off as many ledges, so they may have geared it to be a little bit more difficult to do so with the 3D platforming element. In conclusion, Little Nightmares 2 is more of an expansion than a sequel to me. An experience that can be summarized as an individual wanting seconds for a superb meal, but leaving themselves feeling bloated once they realized they had too much of a helping, and some of the food may have been left out too long between servings. Since Little Nightmares 2 left me feeling listless and unsatisfied, I decided to dive into something else as well. Reaching for another game that I heard was short but delightful, I looked into my digital copy of Thomas Was Alone for PlayStation 4. Gameplay is incredibly simple. You control various quadrilateral forms with different platforming abilities and solve basic puzzles in order to complete levels. Gameplay-wise, you can find more complex mechanics on old Newgrounds Flash games. The factor that makes this worth talking about is the introduction of narration and characterization of the assorted colored shapes.
The crumbling pillar was a dramatic death, she supposed. Wait, what? Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was not, in fact, dead. It was at that moment that Claire realised she had superpowers.
It didn't grip me as much as I initially anticipated, but it was an amusing exercise to engage in. Applying human traits and emotions to near featureless squares goes a long way to instill investment in what would otherwise be nothing more than a basic mechanics test. Now, this should be considered a little more than observation rather than praise. Thomas Was Alone is a rather compact experience with 100 levels, with each one taking maybe a couple of minutes. Even with that in mind, I rarely played for more than half an hour before getting bored and doing something else around my apartment. I did complete it, but that was more out of an attitude of, well, I heard it's short, so I might as well see it to conclusion since I'm this far. Having experienced Thomas Was Alone, I can't say I hate it, but if I recall correctly, I got it for less than $1 in a Humble Bundle. So, about worth that, I guess.
Right. Fear not, my skinny friends, for I am Claire, and I will save you.
In short, two snacky games with equally unimpactful impressions. This week I've been playing... Sometimes to deal with the difficulty of being alive, I need to believe there is a possibility that life is not real. Yes, that is the full title, and I'm not going to recite the full thing anymore. I'm just going to refer to it as The Game, or Carl. To give some glance behind the curtain about the thought processes that determine what game I'm going to be playing, I find it's often determinant of my surroundings. I YouTube as a hobby and have a full-time job that occupies most of my time otherwise. That being said, the time I have to spend playing video games is occasionally a rare commodity. Hence, this week I'm reviewing a very short title. After playing Digimon Survive last week, I was left not knowing what I wanted to play. Fortunately, a friend of mine who's also a graphics artist who occasionally does my thumbnails told me about Carl. You see, I'm occasionally attracted to the weird or unorthodox, and one can understand the unorthodoxy of a video game title being abnormally long simply because that makes the game difficult to market. Another game with that issue that I ended up enjoying in the past was, get ready for this one, Holy Invasion of Privacy, Badman. What Did I Do to Deserve This, My Lord 2 on the PSP. Yes, that is real. But anyway, back to Carl. Carl is a mixture of several things, and all of them come together in a weird amalgamation of jarring visuals and fairly simple gameplay. The game starts in a third-person view of a humanoid alien-looking creature, and you are then able to explore a miniature sandbox, which is basically a couple acres surrounding a pond. You can see most of the sandbox inside 5 minutes, and as you do, you'll come across a couple hubs which will ask you if you want to experience assorted sub-games. Well, 3 games in a mode where you press a button, you zoom in on a section of some giant tower, observing the mutant-looking masses toil, while text boxes and some philosophical point or observation about the world pop up, and you'll find that those text boxes become increasingly prevalent as you explore other modes. Speaking of which, there's a very brief and very insubstantial shooting minigame. There's a third-person walking simulator where you play as a giant slice of pizza. There's a 2D platformer with some text in the background that tells a brief story as you navigate the level. And there's a first-person walking simulator containing some visuals that were almost the point where I turned off the game, doused my computer in gasoline, and broke out my favorite alcohol to act as brain bleach as I watched the flames dance.
Help me. Please help me.
Excuse me, what?
But then I had a brief thought. If I'm having my sensibilities challenged so much, then there's probably a few things to dissect here. However, after looking at length, this game seems to be one thing first and foremost. It was something made for the sake of the creator. There are a few moments of the game where the creator seems to be speaking directly to the audience, seemingly explaining their rationales behind some of their decisions or why the game looks the way it does. You're effectively looking into a surface-level stream of consciousness. That stream also includes the recounting of rather bizarre dreams, I'm sure we've all been there, fictitious accounts that are laced in metaphors, and general observations about the late-stage capitalistic hell we're entering that's blatantly apparent for anyone who's paying attention. Some of it comes across as potentially pretentious, and the characters and general visual style has a certain lack of polish to it, but that may be intentionally utilized in order to enact a sense of the uncanny. And there's a few layers further to briefly mention. First of all, this game openly advertises itself as something that you can leave idle, similar to a screensaver, so that it can be observed and passively enjoyed in the way that someone might enjoy a fish tank or an ant farm, except filled with computer-generated simulacras of semi-demonic-looking creatures that like to rave. Also, this game has multiplayer. Not that I'm aware what further this game offers in multiplayer, but also I'm kind of scared to try it. Not just for the continued exposure of jarring visuals to discomfort me, but for the fact that, at the time of writing, there are some stability and technical issues. I couldn't get one of the achievements to activate in spite of meeting the supposed requirements, and I did have at least 2 crashes in my playtime. Now, some might interpret my last few paragraphs as overly negative, but that's not my overall impression. In fact, my impression is decidedly neutral.
I have no strong feelings one way or the other.
Gameplay can be boorishly simple at times, and most of the content can be observed within an hour or two. But as I said, this seems to be a game more for the expression of the artist rather than the audience. I also said that this seems to trace the creator's stream of consciousness, and the further critique of such makes it feel like I'm belittling their personality. And quite frankly, I don't want to do that. This game is different. I'll leave it to anyone who's willing to experience it to determine for themselves if it's good or bad. It's only $1, and let's be honest, most people would spend more than that on an ice cream bar for 5 minutes of joy, and the need for an hour on a treadmill to assuage the guilt afterwards. All I'll say for anyone that's willing to try it is go in with no expectations while maintaining an open mind. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go cleanse my palate with some games that I know I'll enjoy. This week, I've been playing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Cowabunga collection. This may frustrate a person or two to hear, but I don't really care much for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That's not saying I dislike it, it's just never been a high priority on my radar. I did briefly follow one of its incarnations for a while, but that was most of my interest. This extends to the video games as well, though in my time collecting, I eventually got a small handful of titles, although I don't have them now. You see, in the past couple of months, I've been actually in the process of reducing my gaming collection. I live in a small apartment and it suits me, but that means my space is at a premium, so I've been eliminating redundancies in my collection. Extra copies of titles that I had across multiple systems, or games that were initially released but included later in remasters or compilations have slowly been getting trimmed away, until the point where I can still play a game in some form or another, while still having my storage as close to maximum efficiency as I can get it. That was the first reason why I was interested in the Cowabunga collection. It allowed me to trim 2 NES games and a Sega Genesis title. The other, though, was the value of this title from a preservationist view. A portion of the games in this collection were never released in their original 1-to-1 incarnations physically apart from standalone arcade cabinets, which means I immediately took interest. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of arcade cabinets created over the years that have not received physical incarnations for home markets, so from the standpoint of a collector who believes in preservation, this package was a great thing. For a complete list, it includes Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a side-scrolling beat-em-up for arcade and platformer for the NES, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, also for the NES, TMNT Fall of the Foot Clan, a side-scrolling platformer for the Game Boy, Turtles in Time, a side-scrolling beat-em-up for the Super Nintendo and arcade, TMNT 2, Back from the Sewers, another Game Boy platformer, TMNT 3, The Manhattan Project, another beat-em-up for the NES, The Hyperstone Heist, yet another beat-em-up on the Sega Genesis, TMNT 3, Radical Rescue, the final Game Boy platformer in this list, and the TMNT Tournament Fighters, a 2D fighting game for the NES, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis. 13 games in total, which is some pretty good bang for your buck. And for clarification, it includes each version mentioned. Now, I'm not going to be doing an in-depth review of each individual game, just a few overarching points shared between a few titles. Because frankly, there's a lot of overlap. Let's start with the easiest. The Game Boy platformers are all incredibly basic. Move to the right, jump when prompted, and attack. The visuals are very simple and you're zoomed in pretty close, making it difficult to see anything more than a few in-game feet ahead. Kind of a given for the platform of the time, but ultimately inoffensive and amusing little time wasters to say the least. Next up are the entries for tournament fighters for the NES, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis. By comparison to other fighting games I've played, these seem rather simple. That doesn't necessarily mean they're bad though, and I could be entirely wrong. You see, I like fighting games, but I'm terrible at them. This could probably be resolved if I were to have a regular partner to just mess around with fighting games in general, but that's besides the point. Anyway, Tournament Fighter seems like something that would be good to play against a friend while sitting on the couch. Next up is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for the NES, the side-scrolling platformer. It's as bullshit as I remember. Then again, this was the era of the NES, where the majority of the games were cheap, punishingly difficult, or poorly explained, and bing bang boom, we have all three. Nonetheless, it is a nice nostalgia trip, and the addition of save states certainly makes things easier if you actually want to try and complete this game. Finally, we have all the side-scrolling beat-em-ups. This includes Hyperstone Heist, Turtles in Time, The Manhattan Project, and a couple others. In my experience, and what's been confirmed by playing this collection, is that side-scrolling beat-em-ups for me suit well for short-term quick-hit fun. To further clarify, I find the genre frustrating if I play it too long. It was obviously designed to be as punishing and difficult as possible so that it could bilk its target audience for quarters for extra lives. That investment at the outset created a lot of tension for the target audience. However, I've come across a frustration that operates from opposite standpoints depending on whether it's an arcade version or a home version. If it's an arcade version, you can give yourself an infinite number of lives by simply pressing the start button. If it's a home version, your lives are finite and you're sent back to the start of a level. On one hand, the infinite lives for the arcade ports neuters most of the tension and becomes strictly a process of pressing the attack button enough. On the other hand, the home versions get annoying when you battle all the way to the end of a level, only to have some of the cheaper elements of the side-scrolling beat-em-up do you in, and then you have to go again, and there are plenty of cheap elements to contribute to that frustration. From spamming hard-to-hit, fast-moving, or airborne enemies, to environmental elements with no clue as to what they do until you activate them, it's quite clear that this game was meant to extract as many quarters as humanly possible while trying to keep the threshold of frustration low enough to not have the person quit. When playing solo, it can be kind of tedious and grows repetitive quickly. With friends, it has a much stronger appeal through a sense of cooperative struggle. In conclusion to the games themselves, while appreciated as a means of cataloging the gaming history of a specific franchise, the games are of limited appeal outside of the fanbase, and their charm can wear quickly without others to enjoy by your side. However, in a final note, I found a few additional touches to the Cowabunga collection that extended beyond a simple compilation. The menu style, the graphical flourishes, and the presentation of everything surrounding the base package shows a reverence and care for the series that I wasn't expecting initially, considering that most of these games were developed by Konami. The games may be shallow experiences, but there's a deep appreciation for all the surrounding elements. Bonuses such as soundtracks, an archive of all the covers to the various comics, information on all the cartoon series, strategy guides, and all sorts of other pieces of bonus content are impressive if nothing else. And even though I'm not a fan of the series myself, I can't help but admire and find myself envious, hoping for something similar can be done for other multimedia franchises that I love. Imagine a compilation of every title of vintage gaming for franchises like Dragon Ball, Star Wars, or any other franchise you care to mention that strikes you right in the nostalgic feels, and having them treated with reverence and care as history of those various properties.
Before I get into the meat of this review, or if I sound a little bit different, or my tone is a little bit less energetic, I've been sick. Nothing serious, but it does affect how I'm able to talk. That being said, this week I've been playing Pokemon Violet. Now, I need to confess something to everyone. I agonized for a bit over whether or not I was even going to review this game. One of my first chopping block videos was Pokemon Sword and Shield, and I ended up sinking about 1,000 hours between the two titles. Most of that was split between breeding for shiny Pokemon or participating in raids, but nonetheless, the base package facilitated me willing to do that. However, my stances and attitudes for Nintendo have heavily shifted since then. Without going into fine detail, I've decided that under most circumstances, I'm not going to cover first-party Nintendo titles, because I don't want to make the mistake of praising a company that I feel is making blatantly anti-consumer choices. But let's not forget, Pokemon is not just a Nintendo property. It's shared between Nintendo and Game Freak, so with that in mind, consider any praise I may deliver directed towards the developers at Game Freak. So, how does it fare? Well, before I get to that, let me state that my expectations were already fairly high because of Pokemon Arceus Legends. By the way, I don't care if you're going to correct me on the pronunciation of Arceus. I pronounce it that way, and you can f*** off. I didn't review it at its release because, well, Nintendo and all that, but there were more than enough voices singing its praises at the time. It was genuinely good, shifting gears to seamless world exploration and emphasizing a focus on capturing and cataloging. It featured moderate stealth mechanics, a genuine danger to the player given that Pokemon could attack you outside of battle, and it no longer had the disjointed separation between battles and the overworld, that even up until Sword and Shield caused an encounter to transport you to some other dimension that was loosely resembling whatever area you had been exploring prior. In fact, the capture mechanics were so polished and emphasized that I began to view entering combat for wild Pokemon as more of a punishment. Being able to stealth up to a random wild monster and throw a ball into the back of its head completely unaware was a far more preferable interaction for me. Quite frankly, the only way I would have been perfectly happy is if Violet and Scarlet brought all of that with the newest generation. Spoiler alert, it didn't. What it did bring over was the ability to explore a seamless world and no longer teleporting you to that alternate dimension I alluded to. Unfortunately, the enhanced capture mechanics and ability to catch monsters outside of battle has been completely removed. It kept a couple traces of those elements by allowing you to still stealth through tall grass, and you can effectively get a free turn on an opponent if you can smack them with the ball while they are unaware. But when I discovered that they were reverting to the traditional capture system, to say I was monstrously pissed was an understatement. Speaking of being monstrously pissed, Nintendo needs to wake up and realize that about half of their audience are longtime fans that have experienced a couple Pokemon games by now, and they don't have to have their hands held with the first hours weighed down with tutorials. This could come down to asking 2 or 3 additional questions in the introduction. Have you played any previous Pokemon games? How familiar are you with Pokemon? Streamlining the introductory process for longtime fans would be very much appreciated and could result with a few menu option presets, or in the very least plopping you in front of the professor to pick your first Pokemon immediately after character creation and have that be where you start. I cannot emphasize how much the start of this game got my blood boiling. Everything mentioned so far was already kindling the fire I wanted to ignite here, but then I started to experience some of the technical shortcomings. There's not necessarily much that is game-breaking, but visual glitches, choppy frame rates, animation f***ups, and ad hoc character model quality fluctuations give the impression of a game that is terribly unpolished in its presentation. I did also have at least one hard crash to the Switch home menu during my playthrough. It's likely that Nintendo is going to patch this down the line, but if they keep going at this rate, then their built-up goodwill may start to drain. Given all the complaints I've had so far, one might think that I've given up on this game and I'm not going to touch it much anymore. Well, at the time of writing, that is not the case. Probably the most meaningful shift that Pokemon has made that one could argue is a step forward for this iteration is fully embracing an open world. Pokemon games have been linear to semi-linear since their formation, so it's interesting to see their take where they go full open world, remove the elements of linearity, and embrace exploration like they partially did in Arceus Legends. I recall an early press release for Scarlet and Violet a way back stating that the world would scale to a degree with the player, and that gyms could be tackled in any order. I don't really view this as a positive or a negative, and here's why. To be somewhat concise, there are primarily 2 different kinds of story in-game. One where you participate in the story, and one where you are or make the story. Ones where you participate in the story are usually your more structured and linear experiences with a solidly written beginning, middle, and end, usually with character arcs and a few other elements. This entry of Pokemon seems to be tailoring more for the latter. It's the same kind of mentality that makes me immediately think of Skyrim, where it fosters your exploration and interaction with the world, and, while there are some story beats that will overlap from player to player, the order can be entirely unique on how you tackle things, or you can even ignore the story and just f*** around as much as you want. And speaking of things that you want, I'm unironically loving the fact that the game no longer forces me into battles while I'm exploring the open world. Now, if you want to battle random trainers, you actually have to go over and talk with them rather than just make eye contact with them, and they trap you for the next few minutes. Outside of capturing Pokemon and participating in gym battles, at the time of initial script writing, I have participated in fewer random Pokemon battles than I have fingers on one hand, and almost all of my experience used for leveling up has been through capturing. Although, speaking of gym leaders, Larry is my new spirit animal, and the hyperactive influencer who fights with electric types, who I beat barely having to think, can go get run over by a bus. Nintendo and Game Freak have seemingly abandoned the traditional narrative structure in support of player freedom, so they can experience it at their pace and play the way that satisfies them the most. Unfortunately, the trade-off when someone moves to the open-world structure is the fact that they have to sacrifice narrative control. Pokemon stories have never been terribly spectacular, with the highlight I'd argue being Pokemon White and Black, with it actually tackling moral questions about whether Pokemon enjoy battling, and whether or not it's good for them, or whether or not we're facilitating an alternate dimension version of dogfighting. I won't go into spoilers, but to summarize, the game gives you effectively 3 separate stories. The story where you battle the gym leaders and become the league champion, the story where you fight the assorted antagonist group that has to be present in every Pokemon game, and the third story pertaining to researching mysterious herbs with medicinal properties that result in boss fights. The third story was probably the one that I got the most invested in, which was good because it also resulted in the legendary dragon on the box art, which you're given at the very start of the game, by the way, to gain mobility options. Although I can clearly tell that I went out of the way of the game's intended order, because on some of the boss fights, I was vastly overleveled and ended up one-shotting them. To reiterate, I was mostly able to go whichever way I wanted, with the biggest risk occasionally being an encounter of a wild Pokemon that was slightly beyond my level capabilities, but a couple minutes of grinding
setting would usually resolve that. Finally, I'm just going to devote a quick word to the battle gimmick where you cause your Pokemon to crystallize and gain extra attack power in its chosen elements, which can sometimes be something other than what it naturally features. It makes battles a little bit more interesting in that there's a significant trade-off about choosing which Pokemon and only one element that you can boost at any given time, but I think the visual design is atrocious. Not the Pokemon being crystallized itself, but the headgear to signify what element they are now going to have boosted attacks for. A petty quibble, but a quibble nonetheless. Actually, speaking of petty quibbles, that's also why I chose Violet over Scarlet. If they were going to give the Red Dragon wheels, then just give it wheels, not these stupid flesh protrusions that might make sense on a real lizard for mating or something to that effect, but in trying to make it look like a motorcycle, I think it makes about as much sense as trickle-down economics. Pokemon, as a franchise, seems to be making some significant changes, and while they don't feature all the ones that I would have liked to see, and in implementing the ones that it's doing effectively, they fumbled the ball in several other categories, there is the possibility that I will be sinking a couple hundred hours into this one as well. At this point, my biggest grievances are with the intro to the game and the lack of technical polish. If my attitudes shift at all, then I may have to do a supplementary review, or heck, I may do another 1 year later video. Honestly, if you haven't already bought this, then I would say wait until a few patches come out, and, not or, and, until a price drop or sale takes effect. And given how stingy Nintendo tends to be with their top-tier intellectual properties going on sale or price reductions, I'd say you'll be waiting a while.
This week I've been playing Apex Legends on Xbox One. Those who follow my content will recall I spoke of this game a few videos back. To give some background, my friend and cameraman moved away several months ago, but prior to that we would meet up and hang out every week. With life dragging us kicking and screaming in opposite directions, we endeavored to maintain a means to hang out each week. Apex Legends has become that means, and what a means it is. Developed by Respawn Entertainment, Apex Legends is a squad-based hero character battle royale first-person shooter set in the same universe as the Titanfall series, and before you ask, no, there are no giant mechs. There is a robot hero you can play as, but he's basically the robot equivalent of Spider-Man having just gone through an academy on good manners, and he's just one of 12 playable heroes you can select with unique abilities, traits, and playstyles. Anything from tanking damage and providing cover like Gibraltar, healing and support like Lifeline, mobility and speed like Octane and Pathfinder, and those made to disrupt and lock down opponents like Crypto, Watson, and Revenant. Like many Battle Royale games, you get dropped into currently one of 2 maps and are left to your own devices to find weapons and equipment. Anyone familiar with Call of Duty's or Titanfall's mechanics will feel right at home. The gunplay is snappy and satisfying, and there's a wide range of guns to facilitate varying preferences on how you engage. There's also a gun range where you can test out the various tools the game has to offer so you can figure out where your strengths may lie. Call of Duty is an apt comparison considering Respawn Entertainment was founded by Infinity Ward alumni that left when it became obvious that Activision was being a bunch of greedy dick blisters. The more things change, the more things stay the same. Unfortunately, they went running to the arms of EA, so of course it has loot boxes and the typical array of Skinner box gambling mechanics. However, it's slightly forgivable considering that Apex Legends is entirely free to play should you decide to seek it out. There are no pay-to-win mechanics save for the ability to unlock all the extra characters right off the bat. Unlockables otherwise consist of cosmetics in the form of weapon and character skins, badge and notification customization, unlockable taunts and one-liners, and theatrical kills for opponents you've already disabled. Being the obsessive collector I am, it's minorly worth pointing out that there are physical disc-based versions floating around that provide a few incentives like skins and in-game currency right out of the box, but the free-to-play version is perfectly viable as far as I'm concerned. The package is overall very solid, but the biggest downside of the game is unless you are a god-tier player, you should try to have a friend or two already lined up to play this game with you. Being a squad-based game, if you go in with a solo mindset, you will likely get knocked sideways very quickly, and your success and failure rate becomes highly dependent on the quality of your teammates. Matchmaking is perfectly willing to accept single players and set them up with other singles or doubles, but I've seen teams fall apart and get decimated because one player wanted to go off on their own to kit themselves up with some of the best equipment, and then getting picked off when another team happened to notice them or their teammates when they were isolated. If you can only get one other friend, then you can also have the option of going into a match with a 2-man squad in duos format. You might be thinking that sounds like I recommend this game, and to be honest, I do. The game seems to be attempting multiple means of monetization, try saying that 5 times fast, but it's quite easily ignorable. The creators at Respawn continue to display that they know their craft, and as long as EA stays the out of their hair, then I might be willing to drop a few bucks on this down the line. I just wish whatever money I threw at it could be designated as to what percentage went to who. In my ideal world, EA could go pound sand while Respawn get whatever money I pay. In conclusion, there's a good time to be had here. Just make sure you keep a tight watch on your wallet if you're going to drop money on it, and make sure you're going in with someone you trust to watch your back in a firefight.
This week I've been playing Life. 4 out of 10, complicated and messy, occasional high spots, full of drama, not sure I'd recommend. But you're probably here for a video game review. So let's talk about Atari 50, the Anniversary Collection. Before I start with anything else, let me ask something. Should this be considered an indictment for a lot of AAA studios that I was more interested in this than things like Call of Duty? It might just be me, but I'm beginning to grow nostalgic for the days when I bought a game.
It was a complete video game, didn't need any day one patches, and wasn't exploited to hell with predatory monetization practices. I remember when things like cheat codes, hidden bonuses, and cosmetic adjustments were features to be unlocked rather than paid for. Wait, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, Atari. Jokes and facetious tones aside, I was interested in this title for a few other reasons as well. As a minor archivist and collector, one attitude I have adopted relatively recently is to try and keep my collection as efficient as possible. So if I have the means to play a certain title, then I'll usually get rid of all the others that make it redundant. So when a compilation title advertises over 100 games and I have about 50 of them on an individual basis, I see a tremendous opportunity to reclaim some space and possibly get some spending cash. But Atari 50 Anniversary Collection isn't just a compilation. As with anything experiencing its 50th anniversary, this is a celebration. And I'm sure some out there are going to feel attacked by the acknowledgement that with the creation of things like Space Wars and Pong, Atari is now officially 50 years old. In 11 years, Mario will be 50. Now, I have to level with you for something. I will fully acknowledge their importance and history as the foundation of the medium that I'm talking about and hundreds of millions, if not billions of people engage in every day. But it has to be said, many of the games on this collection are not something that you would consider as good by modern sensibilities. This comes with the understanding that most titles were shooting blind. There were no game design fundamentals, there were no tried and true methods, there was nothing to reference, so almost every single video game that was made was completely new and experimental, and the technology being utilized at the time was restrictive. For the record, if you were to compile the data for every single Atari 2600 game ever produced, which had a maximum data size of 4 kilobytes, that data would be smaller than this JPEG. For the record, this picture is approximately 4 megabytes in size, and there were over 500 Atari games. That being said, it is impressive to see the paths being laid out, and for me, in the very least, it is heartening to see game preservation and history being celebrated, even if the games themselves are rough, basic, or lacking sensibilities tailored for the modern gamer. However, as I've alluded to, this is not just a compilation of games that can be described as rough or mediocre to seminal and pioneering. In addition to the titles, this game features a menu that takes the form of a historical timeline that you can dive into in order to look at schematics, advertisements, commercials, and even miniature documentaries recounting various stages in the development of Atari's games, arcade technology, and consoles. Speaking of consoles, it's also worth noting that this is one of the first compilations that features more than just a medley of 2600 and arcade games. It also features 5200, 7800, Atari 800 PC titles, and even a smattering of Atari Lynx and Jaguar games. I genuinely appreciate these obscure systems being brought forth in this compilation, but it is also worth noting that these are games not exactly one could consider good by modern standards. Especially Cybermorph, my favorite title that constantly is inquiring about what piloting school I attended.
Where did you learn to fly?
There is one final thing to mention before concluding for today. Some of the main attractions for this title are a handful of games that have been tweaked, adjusted, or rebuilt from the ground up in order to be far more palatable for modern players. These were genuinely interesting. I had fun playing them, and I'm probably going to sink a little bit more time into them, which is good, because there are some games that have to be unlocked, and the only way to do so appears to be diving into these modern reinterpretations. After being admittedly spoiled by so many games that can be seen as overly complex to the outsider, I can see why these games were so popular back in the day. The base-level concepts that they established early on in simplistic gameplay allow for a simple-minded fun that can be rather difficult to find in modern gaming. If you're the kind of individual that would enjoy watching things like High Score on Netflix, and would in the very least like to hold onto this collection whenever you hear something foundational in gaming brought up, and you want to try it out to gain some perspective, I can heartily recommend this title. Most others just looking for something fun to play might find a little something here, but honestly it's hard to recommend. This week I've been playing Hot Shot Racing! Now before I jump in, please indulge me in a little sidetrack for the sake of personal background and establishing my history. I haven't touched on it much up until this point, but my favorite genre when I was growing up was arcade racing games. The original Need for Speed and Test Drive Off-Road on PC were my first dabblings. Once graphics got to the 64-bit generation, some of my favorites included Star Wars Episode 1 Pod Racer, Excitebike 64, and the Rush series such as San Francisco and 2049. In the PS2 generation, that love included Flat Out and one of my top 10 favorite games of all time, Burnout 3 Takedown. Needless to say, racing game experiences had a heavy impact on my formative gaming years. AAA gaming as of recent has somewhat neglected the arcade racing game genre, but it's refreshing to know that it's still alive and well on the indie scene.
like IndyCar. Oh, just someone snap my neck. Given examples from a couple generations ago, it's not hard to see why developers started to move away. I love titles like Split Second and Blur, but they never experienced incredible financial successes, and while the AAA arcade racing game genre, while I wouldn't say is neglected, definitely doesn't see massive success outside the usual staples of Forza, Horizon, and Need for Speed. Other attempts have been made with titles such as Dangerous Driving and Onrush, but none of them have really experienced mainstream success. It's also worth noting that none of them really care to try and experiment with some of the really old mechanics, exaggerated drifting at angles that completely laughs in the face of the laws of physics, and over-the-top, colorful, vibrant environments. Well, I'm happy to say that all of those things make a return in Hot Shot Racing by Sumo Digital and Lucky Mountain Games. Hot Shot Racing is a clear and vibrant homage to arcade racers of yesteryear, games like the original Ridge Racer or Sega's Virtual Racing. The graphical style even looks like the polygonal examples that I just mentioned, except the style is also clean and sharp, as though you have run one of those original titles through high-definition graphical settings. It's ironic to have a game that looks so archaic yet so visually crisp. The main Grand Prix career mode consists of 5 groupings of 4 different racetracks, each taking place in visually distinct environments. You have a selection of 8 preset characters you can pick, each one having 4 cars that adhere to different styles of driving, including balanced, speed, acceleration, and drift-oriented tunings. The lowest difficulty setting is normal, at which point it's a perfect place to experiment and find your favorite style. Being a fan of Initial D, I favor drift styles. Although, of a quick side note, I gotta be honest about one thing. Seeing an IndyCar pull the following stunt triggers me somewhere deep inside my psyche. I find it rather hilarious that each car is clearly based off a world model that you can look up, but because of licensing issues, they can't clearly state what each one is. Anyway, I found that my favorite car is the Panoz Esperante GTR1. Sorry, it's the Bullet. This car is called the Bullet.
Nothing else.
Each of the 8 characters has a little bit of a written background story, and if you complete the Grand Prix in the first place, you get a little cutscene. For a game like this, though, I want to say it's kind of like Doom, where the storyline is ultimately irrelevant, and the main aspect is to get immersed in the gameplay mechanics. Now, in years past, I would rock through the normal difficulty and call it a day, but Hot Shot Racing is rather anemic when it comes to single-player content. Playing all the normal Grand Prix races in the career mode was completed in about an hour. Normal difficulty also didn't really offer that much of a meaty challenge. Sure, the opponents were definitely giving chase, but the only thing you really needed to care about or pay attention to was whether or not you had a nitro boost to use in the last 10 seconds of the race. So long as you had that, victory was basically guaranteed. However, if you want to get your money's worth out of the single-player campaign, you will definitely be going to the expert level races, and therein will lie a true challenge. Expert level will require mastery of a preferred driving style and particular familiarity with the behavior tendencies of your car. You screw up once, and it can cost you the entire Grand Prix, which won't allow you to restart an individual race. If you screw up and need to restart on the last lap of the 4th track, you restart from the 1st track again. Management of boost also becomes mandatory, requiring expert drift execution and constant slipstreaming in order to fill your gauges. With elevated challenge, the Grand Prix trophies took me a few hours more to finally beat, but at the end of the day, I'd only played it for about 4.5 hours, which still left the experience feeling anemic. I wanted to try out multiplayer, but unfortunately there didn't seem to be any other players out there. I don't know if this game just doesn't have an open and vibrant community, or I picked a bad time of day, but I couldn't find anyone, which is a shame because there are a few other nice extra modes which play on established mechanics to mix things up. When it comes to the rest of the game, though, I do have a couple issues. While the races are short and restarting might mean about 15 minutes of difference from start to end of a Grand Prix, I don't exaggerate when I say that a single screw-up is all that's required to ruin you on expert mode, again. Not that it needed a rewind function or something to that effect, but in the very least an option to restart an individual race rather than the entire series, because let me tell you, when it's to no fault of your own that you get rammed into a wall by an overly aggressive AI opponent, it can be controller-rendingly frustrating. Also, while the vibrant colors were a nice departure from the usual racing game aesthetic that I've been dealing with for the last couple of years, some levels just went a little bit too far and left me borderline bleeding from the eyes and having a fair degree of difficulty on which way to go next to stay on the track. Lastly, like I said, it's on the short side, but these are the only substantive complaints I can really come across, and if I'm looking this hard for complaints, then I can say it's definitely worth checking out. This week, and for the past couple weeks, I've been playing It Takes Two by Hazelight Studios and published by EA. Charge for everything. Okay, I'm not getting hung up by that. In spite of it being published by EA, there's none of the hallmarks of their usual cartoon villain business practices in effect. No microtransactions, no unlockable cosmetics, just a complete experience that you pay for once and then own.
In fact, it's worth noting that since this game absolutely mandates that you have to have a second player to complete the game, only one copy has to be owned if you want to play online with something, which is definitely nice. Yes, you heard correctly, this game is 2 players only, which seems to be the bread and butter of Hazelight Studios, whose only previous title was A Way Out, which me and my friend Canman played and thoroughly enjoyed up until we had to betray each other and he shot me in the face. It Takes Two, other than being the most appropriate title ever, is an action-adventure title that follows the saga of 2 parents that have drifted apart and decided to divorce with their young daughter caught in the middle. Their daughter then turns to the most rational course of action and uses witchcraft. In reality, she was just hoping to magically get the parents back together, and apparently the universe determined that this was the most effective means of doing so. Really? My phone picks now of all times to go off? Mom and Dad then wake up as dolls that cannot die and have to traverse their property in order to get back to their daughter's room to see how they can reverse their spell. They are, finger quotes, aided by the magic book that their daughter used to place the spell on them, who is the most irritating character that I have experienced in quite some time. I don't know if he was designed this way intentionally, but if so, it's worth noting that a character that is designed to be annoying is still annoying. It's worth noting that whenever this guy was on screen, it was one of the few moments in my life where I thought to myself that maybe a book burning wouldn't be so bad. And this isn't aided by the fact that his visual design is, for lack of a better term, creepy. Uncanny design aside, the book's main cutscene role is to reinforce a sense of collaboration which is ever present in the game's puzzles and action sequences. The 2 characters take slightly different roles and modifications to the gameplay that on their own might be marginally useful but together become enjoyable and hilarious, the latter for occasional griefing moments. And the environmental design is worth mention. As I said before, all the environments take place essentially in different areas of their estate, with building, environmental, and decorative elements being exaggerated and expanded to produce impressive set pieces and aesthetics to foster a more engaging platforming experience. On their own, most of the platforming challenges would be of middling difficulty. However, the injection of another human on the other side gives the feeling of accomplishment every time something is overcome, with the inevitable failure of some puzzles and platforming challenges being mitigated by the near instantaneous respawn system and lack of significant punishment. Some might argue that defangs any sense of peril, and I would say you're not wrong if not for the tone and intention of the game being more for cooperative fun. But while the gameplay leans towards enjoyment, the story holds a lot more emotional weight, as well as points of significant horror when you take them out of context. I speak with no exaggeration when I say that at the start of the story, the 2 parents are absolutely horrible people, and this is illustrated at a point about halfway through the campaign, which I'm about to spoil. To heavily paraphrase their rationale, they believe that their daughter's tears brought the curse upon them and that they need to be cried on and bathe in the shower of their daughter's tears in order to have it reversed. In order to make this happen, they determine that they have to destroy their daughter's favorite toy, which they eventually meet. The scene and gameplay that follows are some of the most genuinely uncomfortable moments that I've ever had to partake in because it mostly consists of dismembering and murdering her, all the while she's pleading with you to let her go and screaming in agony anytime you accidentally remove one of her appendages. And this isn't the only uncomfortable scene you'll come across. Throughout the story, there are boss fights and other moments that I would describe as a kind of body horror, like the first boss, where you defeat him by turning his own suction arms on himself and effectively causing him to gouge out his own eyes. But these scenes of horror and discomfort actually do a fairly decent job of mixing up the pacing from a narrative standpoint, which is good because the game is far longer than I initially anticipated. A Way Out initially racked up about 3 to 4 hours on my playthrough, and I was expecting something similar here, but the horrific elephant toy dismemberment scene was really only about the halfway point, and that was about 5 to 6 hours in. By the end of the game, we see both of the main characters undergo enough changes and make enough realizations that you genuinely hope that they get their shit together. Under other circumstances, you would think that this causes the game to start getting monotonous, but the variation doesn't simply extend to the narrative tone. Gameplay is constantly introducing new mechanics, tweaks, and even genres at times. While a majority of the title is third-person platforming, they introduce elements all throughout, like when it becomes a third-person shooter after you meet the Squirrel Militia, or the stretch where it becomes a dungeon crawler with magic and swords as you make your way through the Elephant Queen's castle. There are even minigames in each level to pause from the main campaign that you and your companion can use to blow off steam. And these were probably the most hilarious moments in our playthrough, with us often degrading to screaming and cursing at each other.
You son of a
followed by a round of laughter once a winner was determined, except when the games were introduced with the most bare bones of control instructions. One of the souring elements of the minigames comes from the fact that me and my friend get so competitive with each other, and these minigames kind of soured the mood overall whenever one of them was introduced, and we weren't able to grasp the controls properly, resulting in the record stating that one of us won or lost strictly on arbitrary decisions by the game.
How do you go so much faster than me?
Press X!
Oh, so that's how you won the last one, Peter.
This could have been solved with a simple implementation of a practice like in the Mario Party titles, just so we could get a feel on how to actually play before diving into competition. Nevertheless, on the majority of these minigames, we were able to have fun, at least while the play sessions were kept short, and now we get to the real meaty criticisms. While the game has plenty of variety, aesthetic appeal, and content, it's a bit on the side of too long, particularly in the last 2 hours or so. By this point, in spite of repeated attempts at continuing to vary, it's blown most of its novel ideas. While still visually charming and interesting to look at, the last few set-piece areas grow tedious. This became apparent in a few segments of the garden level that required us to engage in a third-person ranged combat, but me and my partner were continually blindsided by attacks from off our screens that we had no means of predicting. While the final levels do require some degree of presence from a narrative aspect, the gameplay was beginning to wear out its welcome. Lastly, for anyone intending on playing this game, I recommend playing for no longer than 1 or 2 hours at a time. In longer play sessions, the frustration had a tendency of building, with the other player being a potential source. It's not necessarily that the game is poorly designed in its co-op aspect. If anything, I'd have to say this is due to the fact that it relies so heavily on the co-op aspect that both parties, in wanting to perform well, become fairly focused, and in doing so have the slightest bit of fun drained while they're playing. Let's compare it to Hazelight Studios' other game, A Way Out. While that game was also a strictly co-op title, each player was usually able to do their own thing outside of set-piece moments. It Takes Two, by comparison, has each player being so heavily reliant on the other's actions that you begin to feel led by the nose and count on it so heavily that it becomes draining. This is merely speculation on my interpretation of the psychological aspects, though. In the end, the game is fun, charming, and well worth it if you're looking for a light-hearted play session with a friend. Just make sure you don't overindulge with an excessively long play session, be prepared for some surprisingly dark situations, and try not to get too competitive with the minigames. I love Pokemon. I've had a long-standing history with the franchise and blah 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 blah. If you've seen my This Week video on Pokemon Shield, then you know where I'm going. I've played most of the mainline entries, but that's where the majority of my passion lies. But what about the spin-off titles? My experiences with the spin-off games is actually rather limited. I haven't really put any serious time into the Mystery Dungeon or Ranger series, and the only 2 spin-offs that I've ever spent any serious time in were the original Pokemon Stadium and the original Pokemon Snap, both on N64. About 22 years later, we now have another Pokemon Snap entry, and it was about freaking time! The Nintendo Wii U could have been a great console for another attempt at the series, but considering the experimentation with that system setup led to dumpster fires like Star Fox Zero, maybe we're better off. Speculation aside, the original Pokemon Snap was an enjoyable and simple game. It wasn't incredibly deep, long, or content-rich, but what was there was perfectly fine and an excellent proof of concept. Over 2 decades later, I am thoroughly happy to see it getting another attempt, although I have to admit that upon starting the game I was a little unnerved by the art style of the NPC human assistants. It could just be me, but it also seemed a little more hand-holdy when starting up than the original title. But after a few minutes of setup and menus, I finally got a chance to take pictures in the first level, and the waves of nostalgia came rushing back. The gameplay loop is intact from the original format and simple enough to grasp. The entire time that you're in the level, you have control over your viewpoint as a camera that can take pictures of various Pokemon species in order to try and help the professor catalog the assorted creatures, their behaviors, and the way they interact with the environment. It's basically a child-friendly on-rail shooter. Movement is managed almost entirely by the game. You just look around for the best pictures. Once the level is over, you submit what you think are the best pictures to the professor, and he awards you points based on how well they came out. You then level up and gain access to abilities and items that help you interact with the world in different ways, along with the different levels in their respective biomes. You can also now switch between night and day on some levels, which changes the creatures and situations you can come across. There's one improvement of life feature that I very much appreciate. That's the option for the game to select the pictures for you instead of having to go through each individual one. Now, before playing, I remember seeing an article stating that the new Pokemon Snap was a very relaxed and chill experience, but honestly, it can go either way. If you're in objective mode and trying to improve your score and get the best pictures possible, you will be laser focused and trying to look at everything in the environment with no time to rest. If you want a more relaxed experience, you can go into a level and have that, basically having the stage come across as a mellow nature hike. Now, while I find the experience overall very enjoyable, I do have issues. My biggest complaint is not necessarily with the scoring system, but the fact that you can only submit one Pokemon picture of a particular species per run. This is particularly annoying when each species that you can take a picture of has 4 slots with different rankings, and if you've scored multiple pictures that round, with each one coming to different rankings, then you can only pick one, which comes across as an unnecessarily arbitrary way of lengthening gameplay by making you do a level multiple times just so you can get 4 pictures of a Pokemon with a picture for each rank. It's also worth noting that on the first boss level, taking pictures of one of the new Illumina Pokemon, once I got to the grading screen, it told me that I received level 3 rank pictures, but for some reason they were blocked off, which seems like a rather contradictory message. The scoring system encourages you to get the most amazing pictures you can, but when you're presented with ones that are objectively better than others, you're told without reason that they aren't submittable. Next, the individual levels can also get old pretty fast. You're consistently moving at a pretty mellow pace, so if you're in a twitchy hyper-observational mode, then there's the possibility of stretches in a level that will leave you desperately looking for the next opportunity for anything to happen. This is mitigated later in the game when you get more options that give you direct control on your pacing,
racing, but that doesn't change the fact that it can make early levels drag unnecessarily. Lastly, when the original Pokemon Snap came out, it made sense for there to be restrictions on how many pictures you could take per level since the world was still mostly operating off of film. However, we are now thoroughly entrenched in the digital age, with any number of devices having expandable drives where you can hold literally thousands of pictures, so limiting the player again seems like a rather arbitrary method of making sure the player is forced to stick around. Maybe playtesting revealed that the removal of that limitation also removed some of the fun or tension, but I feel frustrated having to play a level over just because I got a little overzealous trying to get some particularly good shots early on. So ultimately, what do I think? In spite of the aforementioned issues, I kinda like it. Like its predecessor, it's not terribly deep. While it is significantly longer than the original game, that comes from a significant degree of design decisions that mandate heavy repetition that begins to straddle the line of tedium. But at the same time, it's simple, uncontroversial, wholesome fun with plenty of replayability thanks to an abundance of small variations from run to run. Plus, when I get into it, I scream like it's an Austin Powers photo shoot. This week I've been playing 2 games, Inertial Drift and Absolute Drift. Let's start with Inertial Drift. Actually, let's start with my usual background and foundation laying. By this point, my love of arcade racers is no surprise. What I haven't discussed much in previous videos is that I very much enjoy Initial D, and by association, drift racing. I mean, I was recently made unreasonably happy when I stumbled across a guy by the name of Turbo who makes Eurobeat remixes of various songs just because Initial D instilled a love for that genre of music. With that in mind, if the game mentions that it's focused around drift racing, then not only do you have my interest,
but now you have my attention.
So, starting this Twin Drift review session, let's start with Inertial Drift by Pete Cuban level 91. First impressions were good. Inertial Drift is heavily stylized and has an exaggerated neon-lit profile. Unfortunately, that's where the impressions start to bleed off. The story is presented with the usual new street racer here to prove themselves story format, with characters represented by static illustrations and dialogues given by text boxes. I tried investing, but soon found myself pressing the skip in the same way a Karen rings the service bell when she wants to speak to the manager. Gameplay fared slightly better, but quickly wore its charm and gimmick out. The main tweak to racing gameplay is marked by the fact that one analog stick turns the car, and the other controls how far you swing out to drift. It makes for a dramatic-looking drift and gives a unique style to its presentation, but in practice it only makes it so you have to turn with 2 analog sticks instead of 1. Let's demonstrate. To make a very light turn, just press the left stick. To make a tight turn, press the same direction on both sticks. To make a really tight turn, press both sticks and let go of the accelerator. Congratulations, you've beaten Inertial Drift. It also wasn't helped by the fact that once bored, you can look quite silly just by swinging your ass end back and forth given how extreme the drift mechanic visually manifests. Having had my fill, I moved on to the chaser of this twin drifting event. Absolute Drift by Fun Selector Labs, and my physical copy published by Limited Run, is a racing title in a very different vein. First of all, it's an isometric racer akin to RC Pro-Am. Secondly, it focuses only on you and your ability to control your car, and the car's physics and controls are much more complex and satisfying once you get the knack for it. This, however, won't be the easiest task for you. As I said before, the controls and physics make for a challenge in and of themselves, and anyone that's played a racing game with a drifting element that's anywhere remotely in the territory of realistic knows the subtleties of trying to find the right balance of braking, gas, inertia, and steering to make the perfect line mixed with the perfect drift. The sense of satisfaction when you first get a hang on the controls and perform your first ideal drift line is palpable, and from that point I was hooked. Of course, that was after stumbling on the basic starting oval track for about 10 minutes. On that note, the starting track is where I noticed how powerfully simple the visuals are, and that works to its benefit. No flashy neon signs, no distracting and overly ornate obstacles, no opposing vehicles so long as you have ghosts off, just you, your car, a track, and the line that your tires leave on the street behind you. Once you get your rhythm, get a handle on the controls, and get into the zone, the experience becomes very zen. Oh, Absolute Drift Zen Edition. I get it now. That's aided by the rapid ability to just restart if you screw up on a particular level. And these levels are the main means of unlocking an open world that you navigate and explore to progress through the game. No story, no greater purpose, just you and drifting in a car. And it's beautiful. Not only is it beautiful though, but it's also incredibly addicting. On one of the days I was editing this, I went back to go and recapture some footage and decided I was just going to play for 5 minutes, and when I looked back at the clock, 4 hours had passed. So, as you can clearly tell, the following Absolute Drift overtook and clearly surpassed the leading Inertial Drift, and comes out as the superior experience. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go rewatch my Initial D-Box set. This week I've been playing Sonic Frontiers. Before I get into the real substance today, I have to make a confession. It deeply troubles me, and I hope that you, my audience, don't think any less of me.
I understand the connotations associated with this label, and I make every effort I can to fight the negative stigmas that come with it. I'm a Sonic fan. There! I said it! Yeah, we have fun here. Yeah, I'm a Sonic fan, but there's a tremendous caveat to that statement. I'm a fan of 2D Sonic. Sonics 1 through 3 and Knuckles, Sonic CD, Sonic Mania, the Sonic Advance series, Sonic Rush. I would contend that they are better than any of the 3D Sonic outings. In fact, I would make the contention that 3D Sonic has never worked. And this isn't when they're screwing over the franchise with entries like Sonic 06. Counterintuitive design philosophies are just one issue, let alone the fact that I don't think Sonic should have bothered opening his mouth outside of the cartoons. They also probably should have stopped expanding the repertoire of characters after Knuckles, except maybe with the exception of Biggs the Cat and Rouge the Baps. Baps. Now, before anyone starts slamming their forehead on the keyboard to verbally crucify me, let me qualify the statement of 3D Sonic having never worked. Sonic's gimmick is, and always has been, gotta go fast. You can deliver a good-feeling sense of speed and offer complete control within the scope of a 2D game. The restriction of movement along a single plane makes it easier for a designer to predict and compensate for the actions of a player to give a more finely crafted experience. Traditional 3D Sonic levels, however, through what I can only guess is some seemingly irrational adherence to a tradition in Sonic game design, had to facilitate linear 3D paths, and Sonic's movement had to be heavily restricted. In making Sonic fast, you would have segments where Sonic is basically being autopiloted on rails or through loops and gorgeous-looking vistas with very little actual control from the player. In fact, the player trying to make inputs on some of the 3D levels would more often than not result in punishment or death. To maintain the quick speed and impressive style of the game, they need to limit player controls in a very strict and select number of inputs. In order to have more intricate platforming challenges, Sonic had to slow down. Do you see the problem? Not every player should need to hone their platforming skills to the same degree as a speedrunner. Booting up Sonic Frontiers, this was all in the forefront of my mind, and it was not aided with the very start of the game opening with a traditional 3D Sonic level. However, once the level was completed, Sonic Frontiers throws you into an open world, and I will now make a qualifying statement after having experienced it. 3D Sonic has never worked until Sonic Frontiers. Don't get me wrong, Sonic Team has seemingly stumbled into what I think is the direction that 3D Sonic games should move forward in. But like a historian with kleptomania, they can't let go of the past. There are essential moments in the game where you still have to engage in, finger quotes, traditional 3D Sonic levels, and these levels being included offered a nice single package comparison in order to further solidify my posture. Once you're allowed to run free and explore the open world, Sonic's movement is less restricted and immediately becomes a lot more fun. His lock-on function makes combat quick and satisfying to an equal degree of his movement, and he's given a repertoire of secondary moves that further enhance the experience, such as the ability to run a circle around an enemy while drawing a ring in order to make them vulnerable, along with things like continuous barrages of shockwave projectiles. As I said, Sonic Team appears to have accidentally stumbled into the gameplay loop that they should focus on in future. However, as a longtime Sonic fan, I would contend that Sonic Team is physically incapable of understanding when they've found a consistent and quality feature for them to continue in future entries. Which leads me nicely to the story of Sonic Frontiers. I won't do any major spoilers, but I can still levy most of my significant criticisms without dropping them. Tonally, Sonic the Hedgehog has no idea what it wants to be. Sonic's visual design is, and always has been, one of his strongest characteristics. Oozing with 90s attitude, along with bright, colorful, and jovial aesthetics, you'd think a story would in the very least open in a more lighthearted mood. Nope! Sonic Frontiers opens with a melancholy state, and quickly starts tackling topics such as separated lovers, death, and uncertainty in an uncaring world. I wouldn't necessarily mind the game diving into topics such as that, but they need to ease you into it because, as a reminder, your main character is a cartoon rodent designed to be appealing to kids. And this makes the game come across as schizophrenic at times. One minute you're talking with Amy about deceased lovers, and the next you're jumping into an exciting and bombastic mini-boss fight that you come across simply by exploring the open world. And I don't speak with exaggeration that the major boss fights in Sonic Frontiers are possibly some of the most visually exciting that I've experienced outside of Ashura's Wrath, except all of it is directly controlled by you instead of being creatively crafted camera angles with QuickTime events. Actually, the more I think about it, Sonic's inclusion of so many disparate and inconsistent elements spreads to other things, some of which are appreciated, others you have to question their inclusion at all. Sonic's unlock tree of skills might have well have just been locked to story progression on the first island, because I had most of them before I ever left. The fishing minigame was nice and relaxing, though. And this game in length is far more robust than I initially anticipated. It took me about 6 to 8 hours to get off the first island, and there's 5 significant different locations to unlock as the story progresses. I think it's rather arbitrary that you have to unlock the Chaos Emeralds on each island, but I suppose just giving you the ability to run straight to the boss fights would have been a bit too much freedom for the player. Sonic Frontiers has shown that Sega and Sonic Team are capable of distilling Sonic into a serviceable 3D format. If they can only learn what to focus on for future iterations, then I might actually start to look forward to 3D Sonic games. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to self-flagellate for the sin of debating whether or not to make an OC for Guillotine the Hedgehog. My name is Guillotine, and this week I've been playing Dear Esther. Well, I say this week, but in reality it was more like a lazy Sunday morning. You see, I've lately been on somewhat of a light recovery mode, both on my personal and professional life, getting myself restabilized on an emotional and functional level. That being said, I was looking for a game something of a more relaxed and laid-back mindset, and I decided what better genre than Walking Simulator. I figured I would start with one of the more known, early established, and more talked about entries in the genre, Dear Esther. I actually tracked down a physical copy from Limited Run a while ago because I got into that relatively recently. Console gaming is easier for me to play and relax with, given that I can choose my favorite seat and lay back with a controller rather than having to lean forward with a keyboard and mouse. This I found to be one of the better ways to consume a game like this. Lean back, put on a good set of headphones or make sure you have a good sound system, and prepare for some atmospheric storytelling. Now before I begin, let it be known that I'm going to be keeping spoilers to an absolute minimum. Honestly, it's best to be going into this title with as little knowledge as possible other than the fact that this is a walking simulator in its purest form. The only controls are moving around and zooming in your focus on specific elements of the environment. No monsters, barely any NPCs, and no inventory management or ability to pick up or even jump. You move and you look around. It's also worth noting that this game is extremely short. I beat it in less than 2 hours, and take that for what you will. But once the game starts, I found myself getting immersed almost immediately, after I went to settings and activated Y inversion because I'm a mutant that's been ruined by Star Fox 64.
Do a barrel roll!
From the start, the most direct means of storytelling is with a voiceover of what I can only guess is the main character speaking. I don't say that with certainty because it's never thoroughly established. The game also quickly rewards those who pay attention to their surroundings with small details that builds an incredibly personal and tragic tale as you find them. Also from the start, you find many mysterious elements such as a Nautilus diagram for pi, chemical compositions using the periodic elements on the wall, and what I can only guess is diagrams of living cells. Immediately, this activates corners of my mind trying to figure out what the hell this means, and this is where I was hooked. Through the narration, you receive the history of the island's first occupant, the tale of the character that I can only guess is the one I'm controlling, and elements that I can't determine with certainty if they aren't the ramblings of a mentally broken individual. And the fact you can't interact with the environment actually gives credence to this mindset. Are some of the details in your environment actually there, or are they disjointed hallucinations of a man that has experienced mind-shattering trauma? I'm not going to go any further because, like I said, it's best for an individual to go into this with as little detail as possible. I'll simply conclude with this. When the ending came, I sat up in my seat and had chills run up and down my spine for a good 20 seconds. This game is not for everyone, but everyone should at least attempt to experience it. As I said, the main downsides from what I could determine are that you have to be of a specific mindset to receive the story, and it's extremely short, so I can understand someone not willing to shell out the money. I love Pokemon. When I was 9, my first gaming device I ever purchased with my own money was a blue Game Boy Pocket, and the first game that went with it was Pokemon Blue version. I've played every game since and have my own stories and accounts of the series. So of course I was going to get the newest entry. I chose to play Pokemon Shield, but let's be honest here. The differences between versions are negligible, and let's be frank. Most people know what a Pokemon game is by this point. You travel the world, gather new and interesting creatures, and make them fight, remembering type advantages while challenging various leaders until you can be champion of the region. You'll have a rival, fight some seedy or annoying organization, and probably have to save the world along the way. Also, since X and Y, there have been special Pokemon that do a transformation or a unique super move. Before it was Mega Evolutions, now it's called Gigantamaxing. That formula has remained very much unchanged. So what's new this time around? Well, the user convenience features and updates are more prevalent. All the Pokemon in your party gain experience from the very start of the game for every Pokemon you fight and or capture. World navigation features are all unlocked through equipment and menu options, and Pokemon you capture that are sent to storage are accessible at any time. Also, like in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, any Pokemon that you want to capture can be seen on the overworld before you ever encounter them, reducing most random encounters. All of these features are very much appreciated and remove a lot of the long-standing tedium in the series. That covers most of the changes to the game from a primarily single-player aspect, but what about the online features? Per Nintendo's usual tendency, this is where things stumble. While the base online package is best described as passable, the fine minutiae leaves a lot to be desired. Surprise trading helps fill in the Pokédex, and it's fun to add random elements to your team. I wouldn't know what online battling is like right now because I tend to spend a lot of time breeding guys before I ever go into the fighting. The newest and one of the most heavily touted features is raiding, where you and 3 others team up to take down and capture powerful Pokémon. Too bad the matchmaking sucks a big fat one. This game attempts to incorporate an active social feed, but as I said before, the online is poorly done. There is no directly controllable refresh function, so you have to hope that relevant notices happen to pop up, including raids to join. Plus, if you want to do a raid, but can't get any humans together, AI will fill the reigning spots. And let me be perfectly clear, the Ally AI and their Pokemon choices in raids seem to be composed of blithering idiots. I've never garnered such hatred for Eevee's helping hand move, or the simple presence of a Wobbuffet or a Solrock. I get that this is meant to incentivize teaming up with people, but as I said, the matchmaking sucks a fat one. Raid invites consistently expire or have some communication error associated, and the stated inability to actively refresh leaves you twiddling your thumbs and getting irritated. But I digress, that's getting more into endgame content. Lastly though, what about the whole Dexit controversy? The fact that you can't catch every creature of the approximately 1,000 that's been made ever since the series' inception. Honestly, I personally don't care that much. I caught them all the way up to Ultra Sun, where they currently sit. And as of last week, I completed the current dex. I can see why some people would get aggravated, but I personally am not that invested or angry. Besides, 400 plus Pokemon is still a metric ton if you are going to try and get them all on your own. However, if Nintendo and Game Freak decide to add them back in down the line with a price tag, then I am going to be P-I-S-S-E-D pissed. So do I recommend it? As a Pokemon fan, I give this game a tentative recommendation. If you don't like Pokemon, then this game probably won't change anything, even with some of the more monotonous features removed. Then again, if you do like Pokemon, you've probably already bought it. At the end of the day, I like it and have sunk a lot of hours into it, but the lacking online features do leave a sour taste in my mouth.
This past week, I've been playing Chernobylite. Actually, I've been playing several games, but this is the first one that I was able to sink my teeth into. I tried playing Kingdom Hearts 3, but I found that the game's story and mechanics were completely getting away from itself, and I couldn't stomach more than 4 hours. By the way, you can consider this my Kingdom Hearts 3 review as well. Anyway, back to Chernobylite. The very start of the game's narrative is somewhat disjointed and is constantly throwing information at you. Eventually, things settle down and you start to unravel the tangled Christmas lights that make up the introductory exposition dumps. You play as Igor, a scientist from the former Chernobyl nuclear power plant who is attempting to return to the complex to find his lost wife who disappeared in some kind of distortion when the disaster struck. During the initial operation, things go south and you encounter a mysterious superhuman with the ability to open wormholes. He shoots one of your allies dead, grievously wounds another, and is about to finish you off when you use your secret weapon, your own wormhole generator, which is powered by a mysterious element created by the anomalies taking place at the former reactor, the game's namesake, Chernobylite. Having made your escape, you and your remaining allies set up an operating base to set out on missions in order to make another go at figuring out what happened to your wife. Now, the story from what I've given so far may seem fairly simple and straightforward, but trust me when I say that some parts later in the game go completely off its rocker, but not in a bad way. Taking place in the former Soviet Union, of course the game is laced with espionage, corporate interests, love triangles, and just a little bit of war crime. The gameplay is very reminiscent of titles like Metro Exodus or Stalker, and the game's best parts are revealed once you are dropped in the first open-world level. I don't speak with exaggeration when I say that the atmosphere that this title builds is oppressive, tense, and completely immersive. You have to be constantly on your toes and aware of your surroundings, or else you will very quickly get wrecked by military contractors, radioactive humanoid monstrosities, and those aren't even accounting for the supernatural encounters that left me genuinely chilled at the very start. Fortunately, as long as you stick to the high brush, the stealth mechanics are fairly forgiving. I believe that this is an excellent means of storytelling and characterization. You are a scientist, not a one-man army, and the game rewards you for careful evaluation of your surroundings. My first combat scenario was quickly met with death, and early on you learn that combat is often not worth the limited necessary resources or the danger to yourself. Even successfully engaging in combat in the first hours of the game has penalties. In addition to having to monitor your health and radiation levels, you also have a bar that monitors your current mental health, and as one would expect of a scientist, killing an opponent does heavy damage to your psyche, which again takes resources and time to rectify. In fact, let's talk about that. In the early campaign, you have very few helpful items such as healing items or weapons. Even if you take down one of the armed guards patrolling the wasteland, their weapons are biometrically locked, meaning you can't use them, and you will likely only get a pittance of bullets out of each one.
You eventually get to the ability to craft not only these necessary consumables, but weapons and even fabricators for your operating base. But this turns into a balancing act, which requires more resources to manage because, as one would expect, heavy industrial tools require power and can make an area inhospitable due to waste or other side effects, which don't only affect you and your one ally. Throughout the game, you can encounter other survivors and recruit them to assist you in the final mission, and you don't just have to make them like you, but also keep them healthy. Actually, there's a good chance that at least 2 allies will hate you by the end, because in almost every level, there will be some decision that you'll have to make, and given all the motivations swirling around, the most you can hope for is to maintain neutrality with everyone. I even lost an ally in the middle of my playthrough, and he was gone forever. Although that was just because I kept pissing him off. I could also theoretically lose team members through management of resources. You see, each and every day, you have to give out food rations and manage other supplies as needed, including for yourself. So you get into the act of scavenging levels quite thoroughly in order to try and make sure you and your team have enough to get by. Each day there are multiple objectives, including the main story campaign missions. In theory, you could send an ally to do a main story quest, but they usually have a lower percentage chance of success. If you experience enough mission failures, mismanage resources, or don't tend to your team when needed, then you will find yourself in a very tough situation, especially because resources that occur naturally can become very scarce. This goes even farther to build that oppressive atmosphere that I relished in the early hours of the game. However, that feeling does not last forever. Because I was so desperate to maintain resources and build a base that was able to meet my team's needs, I put a lot of early resources into gardens and resource production, and by the latter part of the game, rarely had to worry about anything. Additionally, as you level up and gain more abilities in combat, the world becomes far less oppressive. Don't get me wrong, if you rush in carelessly, you will get your shit rocked. But you will gain enough power where you can usually rectify a situation that would have otherwise been irreversible. Lastly is the story. I'm not going to bother with significant spoilers, so no warnings should be necessary. From what I was able to gather, Igor gains information on his missions in order to put together a VR simulation of the incidents that led up to his wife's disappearance. These segments come across as walking simulator bits with exposition dumps laden with jargon. They go on way too long, and I wasn't able to just passively listen, considering the best language option was with the Russian dub and English subtitles. Other key points include moments where significant decisions were made with my allies. I was genuinely shocked when I eventually came across a wormhole that I was able to generate that would effectively allow me to go back and redo any choice I made that I might be having second guesses about. And the world would adapt and pretend I'd made that choice all along. It starts to introduce alternate dimension meta-narratives, and I was quite thrown by it. Especially with one instance at the end that, again, I said I wouldn't spoil. Lastly, I want to touch on something that's not necessarily a gripe, but something that I kept coming back to in my thought processes while I played. This game stretches finite resources to the near breaking point. What I mean is the developers were able to implement many impressive things better than some AAA titles I've seen, but if you look closely, you can see areas where they glossed over to focus on other important elements. Every single character in the game has a mask obscuring their face in order to save on animation. Text boxes with faces represent the dialogue exchanges. Many assets are clearly bought from a game engine asset store, but they're so intelligently used that you would never notice unless you're looking for it. The only downside is that there were occasional glitches and crashes that sent me back to the main menu. Nothing at a crucial moment that would have severely soured my experience, but it's worth noting that they did happen enough for me to take note. In conclusion, Chernobyl was an oppressive, immersive, and thoroughly engaging experience at the very start. By the time I got enough power to neuter the tension, the story had me gripped enough to see it through to the end. Many elements of the game are very intelligently designed and shows that the developers at the Farm 51 Games stretched their budget as far as they absolutely could. It could have used a little bit more polish and some focus on balancing in order to maintain tension, but I recommend anyone that enjoyed any of the Stalker or Metro series should get this game immediately. Anyone that wants a power fantasy or a simple, straightforward narrative experience you only need to half pay attention to should look elsewhere. This week I've been playing Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. The modern port is by Asper, with the original by Lucasfilm back when they made games and before they were endlessly f***ing the hopes and dreams of creative developers working on things like Project 1313. Look it up. Anyway, after last week's endeavor down the route of the esoteric, uncanny, and uncomfortable, I wanted to go for something to cleanse my palate. That being said, I decided to reach for my limited run published copy of one of my old-time favorites. Now, I will be trying to give this a fair look through modern glasses, but it should be stated up front that I love this title. Mostly because of the fact that the N64 was the game system that I consider myself as having grown up with as a gamer, and I had it on that. One thing that is significantly different from the N64 version is the inclusion of FMV cutscenes. Joy. I'm so glad we moved out of that. Nonetheless, it does give the title a little bit more insight on the tracks and environments that you'll eventually be speeding around. Side note, according to Wikipedia, even by the Legends community, Episode 1 Racer is considered non-canon for those that obsessively care about Star Wars continuity. I don't, but I have at least one friend that I believe does. Speaking of official Star Wars canon, as far as the movies go, I don't really get up in arms to love or dislike any of them, even the modern iterations. I see why some people hate them, I see why some people like them, I've watched all of them, and I don't particularly care one way or the other. I'll rewatch most of them, but I consider Episodes 2 and 3 to kind of be the low points. I consider Episode 1 to actually be towards the top of the Star Wars movies, and one of the reasons for that is the pod racing scene. I'd argue that it's one of the best movie racing scenes in general, and it makes sense that it would be well suited for a gaming adaptation. Hence today's review. Now, once you start to get control and can do things like navigate menus, you start to notice that this game has a lot of small flourishes that show a bit of passion. The way the backgrounds animate or how upgrades are presented to you through a trip to the junkyard or shop. Another small detail that most people probably didn't know is that the original actors for Anakin Skywalker and Sebulba actually reprised their roles to provide the voice acting for their respective characters. Once the gameplay actually starts, you find that the racing is actually very satisfying. There's a tangible sense of speed, and there's even more small and subtle elements to discover that can get you fairly immersed into the races. Through a few tricks of the controls, you can activate a boost that you can deploy almost whenever, so long as your engines are cool enough to allow it, and you can tilt your pod racer to be vertical in order to navigate narrower crevices in the track. You can take damage while racing that'll begin to affect the stability of your pod racer, but vehicles also feature a repair module that you can utilize in real time on the track for the cost of some speed, but the guarantee that you'll regain some integrity and be able to take more blows around the track. Heck, once you unlock Sebulba, you can double tap the taunt button in order to activate a flamethrower that shoots at your right side. I couldn't tell if it actually damaged my opponents, but I did get an achievement for using it on them 10 times. While the game has a great sense of speed and the menus and gameplay are filled with details that enhance the experience, the sound design is a mixed bag. I mentioned the voice acting briefly, which doesn't really take away from the experience. The sound effects of the vehicles, turbo boosts, and various impact sounds are all fine. However, one element that I eventually took umbrage with was the soundtrack. From what I can gather, it seems they simply took the John Williams action scene scores from Episode 1 and recycled them into the races. This doesn't work for me. A perfect example for a score that translates well into a game is Doom 2016's soundtrack by Mick Gordon. The primary reason why it works so well is that the soundtrack was specifically made for the game. It's dynamic, and the intensity of the music fluctuates by actively analyzing the situations around the player and the circumstances and conditions that they are actively in. It may have been a bit much asking for something so similar back in the day, but in the very least they could have gone for a more muted or better adaptable soundtrack that could more comprehensively cover the atmosphere of a race. The lightsaber fight and space battle to John Williams' Duel of the Fates is an iconic moment, but it does not have the same impact when just bumming along a straightaway. By the way, if I seem to be sparing with certain music or movie segments, it's because YouTube is still a nightmare with copyright. Speaking of things that suck, one thing that I occasionally came across was areas of specific tracks that seemed to punish you due to some jagged but unseen world geometry that could instantaneously take you out. These portions of tracks come across as buggy or potentially unpolished. It's also worth noting that I've actually played this a few times on different versions. My PC Steam version had a rather specific issue where alt-tabbing would cause the game to lose functionality, and the longer I left it running, there was the increased likelihood of the graphics just absolutely bugging out until the game was entirely non-functional. In my experience, the console ports are at least much more stable, but they all shared the same issue of potentially dangerous track geometry. Another minor issue I had was that some tracks outstay their welcome. While some have details that make them come across as vibrant and lively, there's others that, once you've experienced them through, don't really have much to look at. With that in mind, I feel that some tracks would have benefited from being a 2-lap format instead of 3. Lastly, again, this may come down to your own individual taste, but the game isn't exactly content-rich. Most individuals can probably experience the game has to offer in about 5 hours, and that includes beating all the tracks on standard and mirror modes. One tip for if you're going in to get all achievements. Make sure you set the prize money to the all or nothing setting, because otherwise you'll likely not have enough in order to get all the upgrades for your pod racer. On that note, I did get the Platinum Trophy on the PlayStation version. To reiterate, I love this game. It's an area of nostalgia and comfort for me. Barring a few tracks, it's competently made and just feels good to play when I want something fast and visceral. Some elements haven't aged well, but I heartily recommend this for anyone who's a fan of arcade racing titles. Maybe just bring your own personal favorite song remix, unless you're one for poorly matched orchestral sweeps.
This week, I've been playing Darkest Dungeons. In honor of the month of Halloween, I've decided to start playing games that have a good chance of running a chill through your spine. Additionally, if you would like me to do a full review in this voice, then let me know in the comments. I'll probably murder the shit out of my throat, but if you find it entertaining, I'll give it a shot. Alright, that's enough of that. Back to my normal voice.
Oh, jeez, I only did that for like 30 seconds. Anyway, Darkest Dungeons is a mix of roguelike, RPG, and dungeon crawler, where you manage a crew of adventurers in an attempt to reclaim your family homestead from Lovecraftian horrors by exploring dungeons. I actually tried to play it on Steam a few years back, and remember that I started getting into it, but have no idea why I stopped. So, for the sake of an October horror gimmick video, I decided to pull out my PlayStation 4 copy. Booting up, a horrific tone is ever present from the moment you press start. A narrator, presumably an ancestor of yours, explains how your estate included a giant luxurious house that overlooked a nearby town. Unbeknownst to him, though, there was an ancient power that was eventually dug up, revealing a portal to another world. He attempted to explore and released eldritch horrors upon the world, and now your family must redeem themselves by defeating the assorted horrors. You play an unnamed descendant of his whose primary job is to return to the nearby town, utilize it as a base of operation, and ensure that the crew that you recruit from the nearby stagecoach maintains the ability to keep fighting through. The first thing you'll notice when you receive control, and this is a common problem with any complex strategy PC game ported to consoles, is that there are a lot of controls mapped to the assorted buttons. Nothing overly complicated, but they require 2 extra buttons in order to map the commands, and they ended up having to use a touchpad in the middle of the PlayStation 5 controller. When you're not in the dungeons, this is a management and preparation game. However, this doesn't become immediately apparent as necessary until you've been into the dungeons once or twice. So, having recruited your first batch of adventurers off the stagecoach, and more or less guessing the resources that you're going to need for your first trip, you enter the randomly generated dungeons to redeem your family name. You'll quickly find that this is where the horrific aspect sets in. Well, sort of. The game is operating on 2 separate horror levels. First is the presentation, laced with grime, decrepit ruins, evil humanoids, and eldritch horrors. The sound design also aids this tremendously, featuring creaks, background disembodied moans, and ambience that indicates the earth itself does not welcome you. And a continued narration that comments on the progress of you and your explorers along with significant occurrences that may befall them. I love the narrator's voice, and it certainly adds depth to the oppressive environment.
A full pack often attracts unwanted attention.
But after a few hours, it began to become a bit redundant. Lines started to repeat themselves, and I became familiar with the specific triggers for particular lines. However, the devs seem to have accounted for this, and as of playing it more recently, the lines are repeating themselves a little bit less. It may just be a minor gripe regarding the narration that felt worthy of note, but considering the sound design is so important for building the atmosphere that the game relies on, anything that breaks it can be viewed as a significant detriment. But if you recall, I said the presentation and atmosphere is only one element of the horror that this game likes to portray. The other half is the game's constant sense of oppression. It warns you at the very start that this game is meant to be punishing and that you will have characters that will die. You see, Darkest Dungeons mechanics don't play strictly to health bars, healing, mapping and exploration, and combat mechanics once you're inside the dungeons. The game moves to immerse you even further by adding a psychological element to all the adventurers. As one could well expect in a real-life scenario where the profession entails you to face unknowable and unspeakable horrors, you end up having to manage the psyche and stress levels of every party member. In fact, just being in the dungeon for a prolonged period of time can lead to your party's stress level building, and this can cause individual party members to reach their breaking point where they either acquire adverse mental conditions, or if you're extremely lucky, they'll power through and find some resolve in a positive trait that goes with it. But, speaking of luck, this game at times can be controller-rendingly frustrating.
Just as it's possible to roll 4 6s in a row on a dice, it's just as likely for you to get 4 1s in a row, with a bad run causing party members to acquire diseases, mental instability, psychological maladies, and in the worst case scenarios, death. And let's not forget, when a party member dies, they're gone forever. All the work, time, effort, and equipment that they had is instantaneously removed. At the same time, there are other design frustrations that occasionally crop up that don't seem to be intended. Mid-dungeon, provided you've been busy acquiring the necessary resources in order to upgrade your town, you may have to pick and choose what to leave behind. I came across a rather specific issue where I was late into a dungeon and about to wind up the quest, but I needed to make room for a journal entry that I had stumbled across. Thinking I'd be able to avoid the penalty associated with starvation, I dished out my food rations live in the field in order for my party members to heal. Not 50 feet down the corridor, I was notified that the party had been exploring for some time and became rather famished. But I quite literally emptied my food inventory into everyone's belly. It was like confronting a group of lying, conniving cats. I just fed you, and now you're giving me a penalty of psychological and physical damage because you didn't agree? The instances were rare, but things like this, you can only hope it won't turn into something that will screw you over in the long run. As part of its design, the game also features a robust autosave feature. In some scenarios, if you want to try and go back and redo something, the best you can hope for is that you can go to the start of an individual battle and try and get a slightly better dice roll and maybe save one of your party. But the anxiety of having so much hinge on the flip of a coin leads to an overwhelming sense of oppression, an existential horror of constant failure, and a never-ending anxiety that you need to constantly worry about your next move. Maybe a bit overwhelming for some, but I've had significant experience in the first responder and emergency prevention fields, so it's just kind of my casual state of existence, and that should actually kind of be considered horrifying. I will fully admit I'm probably damaged for liking this kind of thing. I find no amusement in superficial horror. Monsters, gore, jump scares, and shadowy corridors do very little for me. When I want to be unnerved, I confront the possibility of betrayal, the tension of ever-present danger, the unnerving realm of the uncertain, and the never-ending battle of trying to rein control on the unpredictable. And this is why I like Darkest Dungeons. A game that can give you so much control, while simultaneously making you feel like you have so little control, and yet still be engaging is a rare thing. The game is available on almost any system of choice, and while the frustrating elements and significant punishment for those that don't learn quick may push many away, if you're willing to put up with the learning curve or dive in on lower difficulties, you can have a game that will unsettle you, yet keep drawing you back in. On a final personal note, this game has to be doing something right when it can make me adjust my morning wake-up routine in order to integrate at least one more run through a dungeon while breakfast is cooking. Any brave soul that hasn't been scared away with what I've described so far should download this as soon as possible and prepare for the worst that the human psyche has to offer in the sinister pit of darkness.
You answered the letter. Now, like me, you are a part of this place.
This week I've been playing Choo Choo Charles. One might ask, Gee, why are you playing this when there's so much big-ticket stuff coming out? Well, it's very simple. To phrase it like the kid from the ASDF movies, I like trains. Well, that's not the only reason. I don't recall how or when, but I remember coming across the 2-star YouTube channel made by the creator of Choo Choo Charles, Gavin Eisenbees. Side note, from what I understand, this individual has developed most of the game by himself, so this game has the aura of a solo developer about it. So, what is Choo Choo Charles?
Are you calling me?
I'm not referring to you right now, Charles.
You keep saying Charles, which is my name!
No, you idiot. The game is called Choo Choo Charles. You don't have a monopoly on that name.
What are you talking about?
Charles, you were explicitly created to be a strawman argument surrogate character when I was doing larger or more thought-provoking videos. This is just my weekly review thing. In fact, you know what? No, I'm done with this bit.
You can't silence me! In fact, wait a minute, what are you doing? Don't you dare press that button!
Anyway, if memory serves, this game started off as a meme. The premise is basically Thomas the Tank Engine, but evil. The story starts out with you going to help capture a mysterious creature for a display, the aforementioned Choo Choo Charles, what seems to me to be a man-eating spider demon occupying the old hull of a tank engine in the same manner that a hermit crab occupies a seashell. Upon your arrival, your business associate is killed and your quest immediately shifts from trying to subdue and capture the beast to killing it and survive. To do this, you're given access to a train which is then used to navigate the island on a narrow-gauge rail network.
Now, one might think from the offset that this game is relying rather heavily on the train premise, but the design circulates so heavily around that not only from the eponymous villain aspect, but the gameplay as well. The train that you use as a vehicle for the story, combat, and exploration. Because everything circulates around it so heavily, after I started playing the game, I felt genuinely uneasy whenever I had to step away from it for a side quest. After speaking with a couple NPCs, you have the entirety of the context for the quest in order to bring Charles down, and then it's strictly a matter of navigating the island, acquiring resources, and snagging the necessary plot items. To aid this, you can upgrade your locomotive using scrap metal around the island, and once I realized how much more effective and safe I was with those upgrades to my engine, I think I finally understand what it feels like to be a dumpster diver with a ratty old pickup truck, because the only thing I cared about was scrap metal. Now, I don't know if I'm just the kind of individual that is willing to be immersed in the story so long as the premise makes enough sense within the context that it's presented, but I found myself drinking in the atmosphere after a while. Navigating the island while listening to the ambience of the rails clattering and hearing the rain and wind left me pretty on edge at times. And after a time, I grew to fear the ominous whistle of Charles on the horizon. And as I said before, I like trains.
But I don't like this train!
As I've mentioned prior, the train you're driving around facilitates combat, and this is through a mounted weapon on the back of the locomotive, and this is partly why I think I felt so unnerved by certain moments. Charles fights you on his terms, and his terms alone throughout most of the game. Your safety and only ability to defend yourself is locked to the machine that must stay on the rails, so if you can successfully deal enough damage to him, he'll go off and lick his wounds to try again later. And you better pray that you're within running distance of your locomotive while on a side quest, because if not, you can be thoroughly screwed over very quickly. The other dangers present to you are Charles-worshipping cultists wearing masks around the island. You usually have to stealth your way past these guys in order to acquire plot-necessary items to engage in the final battle, but these guys were also probably the single greatest source of frustration and amusement. The game doesn't seem to have any significant stealth mechanics other than just trying to move while they're not looking at you. However, so long as I stayed out of their line of sight, I could basically walk right behind them. On the other hand, if I even for a split second seemed to enter their line of sight through a crack in a wall, then it was instantly time to run back to the locomotive and hope they followed me enough so that I could gun them down using my caboose cannon. I feel like there's a lot to flesh out with mechanics and polish with these guys, but then I remembered this is almost a solo-developed project. I adjusted my expectations at the very start to reflect this, and with that compensation in mind, I can't say I was disappointed with most of my experience. Although after a while, my primary tactic for navigating the mines where I had to encounter cultists basically turned into me sprinting straight through in a mad dash regardless of how many cultists actually saw me, grabbing the item, and then booking it as fast as I can hoping that the autosaves had my back, which it is also worth noting that the autosave system in this game is very liberal. Additionally, I encountered a few things that I couldn't tell if they were bugs or just areas that were in need of more polish. For instance, when I was remapping the controls, I accidentally fat-fingered the escape key function and put it on the number 1 key, but for some reason, certain functions just did not accept that I was trying to lock them onto certain keys. Or it could have been the fact that I use a keyboard surrogate peripheral and it didn't play nice with the game. Another significant moment of game-breaking occurred when I was doing my marathon through one of the MacGuffin mines, and given I was thoroughly fed up with the conga line of cultists that I acquired, I said screw it, and while I was running, I clicked on a treasure box to start the lock-picking minigame. Much to my surprise and amusement, I was able to complete the game without any physical interruption or damage to my health, but all the while I could hear cultists yelling and firing shots into the back of my head. Fortunately, what I experienced wasn't exactly game-breaking, but it certainly damaged the immersion, which is a shame because I genuinely enjoyed my experience with Choo Choo Charles. The price tag of $20 admittedly might be asking a bit much for some. For full context, I beat it with 100% of the achievements over the course of a little over 3 hours, but from what I hear, the game is expected to be receiving more content, support, updates, and may even be getting some console ports in the future. 3 to 4 hours may also honestly be the perfect runtime for this game given the context of the mechanics provided and the world to explore, because too much longer and I think it would have started to outstay its welcome. Long story short, Choo Choo Charles is simultaneously hilarious, unnerving, charming, and rough around the edges. Given a couple more months of polish and content updates, I could see this game garnering the audience that I think it deserves. But then again, I could be entirely biased. After all, now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna see what I can get done now that I've remembered that my Charles has a mute button.
This past week, in the spooky month of October, I've been playing Little Nightmares.
I hope you appreciated that because that's as Halloween-y as I'm getting. Alright, moving on. I didn't go into this game with the intention of actually playing this all the way through. I remember seeing screenshots and video snippets of other individuals playing it and thought that the grotesque creatures in the background would make for a good visual metaphor on an upcoming video that I'm working on. Believe it or not, I've actually attempted to play Little Nightmares in the past, but I put it down and walked away after about a half hour in because of some various control issues. But that doesn't necessarily mean a game is bad. One of my favorite games of all time, Mass Effect, had the same start. I began to play it, I thought it was really clunky, and I walked away. But then decided to go at it again, knowing a little bit better what to expect, and proceeded to be introduced to one of my favorite fictional universes. Opening background aside, there will be spoilers later in the video, which I will make abundantly clear once they start, so until then I'll be doing a relatively spoiler-free review. Upon initial impressions, this game appears to be one of those dark borderline survival horror platformers. If you've played Limbo or Inside, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. A small, seemingly helpless creature wandering through a decrepit and bleak environment, trying not to be captured or killed by the various environmental hazards and enemies. While that should be the centerpiece, then at least 2 more blocks on your bleak platformer bingo card. Having very little idea of where you are, you then start moving to the right in typical platformer fashion, and it becomes abundantly clear that you are in a world where you are not welcome and you will die if you are not paying attention. Unfortunately, at least in my playthrough, while death wasn't a rare occurrence, it happened far more than I would have liked, and that is not entirely chalked up to me being the magnificent spaz that I am espoused to be. Limbo and Inside have a much cleaner mechanical element considering that they only need to worry about platforming on a 2D axis, in spite of elements of the world taking place in 3D, especially on Inside. However, Little Nightmares is a full 3D platformer, meaning that not only do you have to worry about moving left and right, but what depth of the platform you need to be aware of. Navigation on a 2D plane comes with a certain ease of execution, and can make for a much cleaner design. This is the reason why 3D Sonic the Hedgehog games have rarely worked out, and considering you're always navigating from the side, I would begin to question some design elements. One design element that I would especially question is the grab function. When running, jumping, and platforming in various aspects, there will be assorted ledges, ladders, or scenery that you'll need to manually grab onto, and some of my more irritating platforming moments came from my fingers slipping off the grab button and me experiencing what I perceive to be an unfair death. It's a small complaint, but I would have appreciated an option where I could toggle the grab instead of having to hold it the entire time I'm climbing a ladder that takes 30 seconds to maneuver. Other cheap deaths came from moments in the game when I was trying to navigate around or stealth through hostile environments and was greeted with a capture or a game over that ultimately resulted in me having to trial and error a few moments just because I didn't know what the game wanted from me, and it sometimes hadn't presented all the necessary information for me to come to the right conclusion. This comes across in a couple brief puzzle segments as well. Eventually, I was able to figure out most everything, again through trial and error, but that removes a lot of the satisfaction elements of puzzle platformers like others that I've played in the past. So far, I've had almost nothing but nitpicks about the game, but if I was having a frustrating time with the mechanics and level design, then why did I finish it to completion? Well, first of all, the game is incredibly short. I want to say that my playthrough came to about 4 hours, but if I were to take a lot of those unfair deaths and retries that I had to reattempt, I'd say it cut down about a full hour of my playthrough. Not exactly the biggest bang for your buck, but I don't begrudge a game just for being short. My absolute adoration for Journey by that game company should establish that much. So what about the final elements that left me willing to see this game through all the way to completion? This is where the game shines. The atmosphere is thick and oppressive, and the storytelling through the background elements and world navigation has a lot to dive into. Now, just be aware, I'm about to delve into spoiler territory, so I'll leave you with these final words before I do so if you don't want spoilers. I give a moderate recommendation and think you should definitely give it a shot, but if you're on the fence, I completely understand if you don't want to shell out the money given its length, layout, and control issues. Spoiler territory in 3, 2, 1. From what I was able to establish, this tiny creature that you're playing as, which I can't tell if it's human or not, seems to be a source of sustenance for grotesque human-like creatures. You're ultimately on a ship or restaurant, and you work your way up from the bowels of the ship, escaping individuals that prepare your kind to be consumed. All the while, you're also finding out things about your character that you begin to question. There was one genuinely unsettling moment in the latter half of the game where the character you're controlling seems to be overcome by hunger, and a small gnome-like creature provides you with sustenance, only for the one you're controlling to lash out and menacingly devour this would-be helper instead. It gives a lot of credence that this place that you're in is a den of gluttony, depravity, and mindless consumption, and the longer that you're stuck here, the more of a corrupting effect it has on those stuck in its throngs. This is shit that I love. Atmospheric storytelling that aids your experience. Nothing is ever told to you, but everything is shown. And there are multiple instances where you remain unnerved by the events unfolding in front of you, but you can't help but want to see what comes next. While some aspects of the game seem to be trying to lean towards horror, I don't really get scared by much of the atmosphere. It unsettles, certainly. There are random and cheap jump scares that would occasionally take place, but it usually resulted in a death, so no positives there. But the imagery of the creatures that you find yourself having to navigate around and avoid give a feeling of the uncanny, an unsettling array of the mindlessly consuming, who will seek out what pleases them, even if it leads to their own destruction. Metaphors and symbology can be traced in every aspect, and I love it. So that's my experience with Little Nightmares. Again, short and occasionally mechanically frustrating, but saved by some excellent world building and atmosphere. And given that Little Nightmares 2 came out recently, I think I might have something to check out now. And to think, I was initially only going to play this thing for about an hour for the sake of some video capture. This week I've been playing Thumper, and before anyone can make the joke, no, I'm not talking about the bunny from Bambi. Now, just a heads up, this one is probably going to be on the shorter side, and not just for lack of substantive content to talk about. After my last couple of videos managed to get a little traction, I decided I was going to take a break from any major stuff. And one way I do that is by picking games that help me blow off steam or cope with stress. And let me tell you, I have had some stress and anxiety lately. But I decided to go back to one of my favorite genres for stress relief, rhythm games. For me, rhythm games are a refuge of pure reaction and execution. Don't get me wrong, I love a good story, bits of lore, and metaphors to dissect, but sometimes I just want to turn off that side of my brain and just do the thing when the magic screen tells me to do the thing. Enter Thumper. Now, when I saw this game initially a few years ago, I had no idea what to expect. It was advertised as a rhythm game, but I could glean very little off of it otherwise. My traditional experience of rhythm games was something like Dance Dance Revolution or Rock Band. Thumper does not compare well to those two. Yes, it is a rhythm game, but only in the sense that the game has inputs that take place loosely corresponding to music. However, if forced to give a one-sentence summary, the best I've thought of is a musical monorail on a bad LSD trip. You play some sort of weird ship bug alien thing speeding into a void along a theoretically infinite track. The game starts off relatively easy. As you move along the track, various obstacles or factors are added that require basic inputs, and upon successfully doing so, audio feedback generates the most important element of a rhythm game: music. As I said, the early levels are somewhat forgiving, with a moderate speed and plenty of spacing between necessary inputs. But once you get into the later levels, the game does not mess around. As with many reaction-based games, Thumper demands your attention. At some parts, the game might mess with you. If you defeat a boss, you may expect a brief segment to collect yourself and breathe. But not Thumper. There's a very real chance that what most would consider a window for a break is simply the intro for the next high-intensity section. Missing a crucial input can easily throw off your timing, and it is very possible for you to be on a tear, only for your attention to break for a split second and instantaneously die. And let me tell you, once it starts stringing together several different types of obstacles and ramping up the speed, you will die a lot. Not that it's unfair. Thankfully, the developers made it so that upon death, you're immediately thrown back into the game at the start of the section you just failed, which helps to reduce frustration. Also, if you have a single screw-up and can regain your composure, by putting in a specific control sequence, you can regain your shield to be able to take another hit. Or if that's too much of a stretch but can make it to the end of a level, you'll have a chance to get your shield back regardless. The game establishes that you are in control over most scenarios, and any necessary inputs have visual or audio warning. And going into a specific, when the ring comes in that shoots you when you miss a crucial input, you know the game is not messing around. It's just unfortunate that the ring can also block some visual cues, and the psychedelic visuals can also occasionally make things difficult to discern. And speaking of things being difficult to discern, I have no idea what to take away from the visuals. I've seen a few people speculating on what it all means. Is it a trip to the afterlife? Is it an exploration of an alternate dimension? Is it strictly a vehicle under which a purely mechanical experience can take place? Good art is left for those to interpret meaning. As far as I'm concerned, the visuals are unnerving, jarring, and are intended to distract from the task in front of you, which I think makes for an interesting juxtaposition. You want to look at and analyze the potential horrors or psychedelic imagery taking place around you, but you must focus on your task. I don't know what it means or even if there's supposed to be a meaning, but it makes you think. I was trying to find a game where I'd be able to turn off this portion of my brain. Whatever, I'm going to conclude this review by saying this. Play this game. It is definitely not for everyone, especially those that may have certain sensitivities to flashing lights and patterns, but if you can, I say try to experience this title at least once. It's intense, it's visceral, it can potentially be unnerving. I can't say I've played many titles like it before, but in the moment, it's a kind of mesmerizing that I rarely encounter.
This past week I've been playing Blacksad Under the Skin. What the heck is Blacksad, you may reasonably ask? Apparently it's a visual novel series that I know next to nothing about. So how did I come across this game? Well, my interest was first piqued when I was looking around at various upcoming releases, and this game's art style was the first thing that jumped out at me, mostly because the character on the front cover looks like Iggy from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure if they were transformed into a full-sized person. Looking further, I discovered that this was supposed to be a detective adventure game akin to The Wolf Among Us and The Walking Dead, which I very much enjoyed, and considering the initial death of Telltale Games, I was open to an alternative. Whether or not the revived studio is any good, we have yet to see. After having played it, I can say that the game seems to be a mashup of the gameplay and story delivery of most Telltale games, with a setting like if you crossed LA Noire and Zootopia if you beat it with a really depressing stick. Minor story spoilers. I'm not going to show anything past the first couple hours, so while there will be very mild spoilers from the very start of the campaign, nothing shown will ruin the overarching story. There, you have been warned. In spite of the animalistic features of all the characters, this game doesn't shy from the struggles with the worst parts of humanity, ironically. Characters are all flawed, damaged, depressing, selfish, and thoroughly well written. The story has plenty of twists and is very much in the vein of the traditional noir detective story, even taking moments to make fun of the tropes and more played out stereotypes. This game has made me very much interested in checking out the comic source material. My only gripe in the writing is the main character, John Blacksad, who feels like some elements of his personality may be muted to serve the player's means of projecting and matching their own morality. But until I read the source material, I won't know for sure. The gameplay is serviceable. If you played a Telltale game, then you'll know what's in store for you for most of the game. Split between action segment QuickTime events, tank controls while wandering around an environment looking for the trigger to move the plot, and conversing with other characters to learn more about the world and the case you're investigating. A murder with ties to the local mob bosses, societal and personal corruption, and racial biases, which feels weirdly implemented in this game because race is tied strictly to fur color. Seems irrational, but what about racism makes any sense anyways? The conversation bits also have the traditional relationship building bits where characters build relationships with you, be they amicable or hostile, with it affecting moments in the story down the line. This became relevant very early where a bodyguard for a local bigwig busted into my office demanding I drop an investigation and lie to his wife who hired me to hide the alleged only time he was unfaithful. I fend him off and he ultimately is at my mercy. Me being the individual who wants to believe people are good, I decline his bribe and give him a chance to honor his word to be faithful going forward. Later I find myself at the mercy of two bodyguards that ambushed me when I came to investigate a possible crime scene, one of which being this guy. When the new one leaves, the one I met before pretends to beat me and tells me to play along, sparing me further injury and difficulty in future fights. The last relevant gameplay feature is a clue and deduction system where you combine various facts from clues you gather and then mash them together to build your case and occasionally move to the next story segment. These parts at times left me feeling rather clever and very satisfied. While I said the gameplay is serviceable, the game is not very well optimized or stable, and this is by far my biggest gripe. I cannot stress how much this game's impression is damaged by the stuttering, texture popping, graphical glitches, and loading times, which it sometimes felt I spent upwards of a fifth of my time in. And the game's poor optimization may have come across in QuickTime events not working properly, where there were at least 2 I've had to do upwards of 10 times, with me literally degrading to screaming at my TV, "I don't know what you want me to do!" I eventually overcame through sheer trial and error, but I played the PS4 version on a PS4 Pro and had all the aforementioned issues. Unless I'm mistaken, we had this game style figured out and optimized on the PS3 and Xbox 360 generation, and this game is nowhere near bleeding edge levels of graphical fidelity. I don't know if the other versions are any better, but I pray that the devs fix this, because in the end, I want more. Even with my outbursts of frustration, I had twice as many moments at the end of the story where I had a twist revealed to me, and I openly verbally exclaimed, "Holy shit!" But like many noir detective stories, there is no happy ending. There's simply an ending where you may have screwed up the least. The developers at Pendulo Studios and Ys Interactive may have a real chance at usurping the Telltale throne if they can make a quicker loading and more stable game. I give a tentative recommendation, because in spite of myriad technical issues, the story is genuinely good, and I'm willing to forgive the shortcomings, but just barely, and I know there are plenty who may not be as forgiving as me.
This week I was thinking of playing This War of Mine, a game where you play as a survivor trying to scrounge around for supplies in a war-torn hellscape, as the other humans around them either perish or resort to their own unspeakable acts in order to carry out the war, or just survive. But then I thought to myself, I don't want to play that. I work in retail, it's the week of Black Friday, and it's only going to bring back the Vietnam flashbacks. So I decided that instead, I would play something nice, peaceful, and something I could just relax into my recliner with. Cue A Short Hike by Adam Robinson Yu. I actually played this a while ago on Steam, but it left such a positive impression that I eventually decided that when Super Rare Games was going to be making a physical copy for the Switch, I had to have it. You play as Claire, a bird girl who's been brought to a small vacation cabin on an island. What's your objective? Well, Claire was seemingly expecting some manner of phone call from their mother, but the island has no reception. The only place where you might be able to get a signal is the top of the mountain on the island, and you're gonna go to, well, take a short hike. That description might say that there is an absolute objective for you to go on, but in reality, the game doesn't really care. This game is intending more for you to relax and take things at your own pace. Do you want to climb the mountain to receive that phone call? Go ahead. What if you get a shovel and just want to go around and dig up treasures? You do you. There's no time limit and seemingly no significant consequence, just an initial overall goal for you to seek when you feel like it. Gameplay is very simple. You have a consistent and semi-fixed isometric view of the world as you explore, and Claire can do basic platforming. The only significant means of character upgrading or leveling that you can do is acquiring golden feathers in order to gain the ability to climb or fly to a limited extent. Depending on the little side objectives that you might be able to take on, you can move a little faster by acquiring running shoes. While I described the game as a platformer, the only real consequence for failing to navigate certain portions of the world is that you have to go around and try again. You don't take damage, and there's no failure state. The game is just pleasant and nice, and this game is exactly what I needed this past week. Okay, given the week I've had and how genuinely this game just made me feel good, I'm cutting off the script and just kind of recalling a few things or gushing about a certain aspects of a short hike. First of all, I really like the art style. It's vaguely reminiscent of Animal Crossing. The creatures are very simple and cartoony, and the pixelated graphics just, have a certain charm about them. And finding all these other characters, the objectives they give, they don't unload a hell of a lot of backstory on you, but some of them just give enough to, make them feel like a character. And a lot of them just, as far as objectives go, they're like, hey, you want to help me out with this thing? If not, no big deal. There's one small relative that I ended up spending a fair amount of time just hunting down seashells so she could make a necklace for my aunt. I remember coming across this one character who was training for a marathon that was taking place on the island, but they lost their lucky headband, so I start looking around for it. And then I talked to one of the other creatures, and turns out they've got a headband that they're not really all that attached to, but it turns out that the headband that they gave me, they themselves were actually a famous marathon runner, and the other person knew them, and they were like more than happy to have this replacement headband that was they now considered even luckier than the one that they lost. There's the artist that you come across doing a bunch of different paintings on the island, and you get to sort of see their own thought processes and see how they're just kind of going around doing their own thing, and getting a look into their mind, thinking about what they're doing as they paint and finding different areas and how they may not be satisfied with certain parts of the painting that they're making, but they don't give up. They just keep going around and doing it. Yeah, and a little bit of a story spoiler here, but the end of the game, it resonated with me. You learn that there was some sort of medical thing that Claire was waiting for a phone call on their mother to give them an update for, and things were rough, but they ultimately worked out, and it gave me a chance to reflect. I spent a lot of the last couple weeks in a fair amount of anxiety, trying to make preparations for my job, trying to overcome my own health issues and, recover from a medley of viruses that I had. And this game helped remind me I need to just take things at my own pace and stop trying to worry so damn much. Just keep plugging along and do your thing, and eventually a resolution will come and everything will work out. Just keep moving. Alright, I'm gonna go back to the script to finish out the video now. I've had enough time to rant about this title and give you my genuine, non-prescripted thoughts on this. Given that you can beat this game in its main objective in about an hour, some might consider this game a little bit light on the ground. But for me, the emotional resonance makes this more than worth the asking price. I hope this game is exactly what someone needs as we go screaming into the holiday season. This week I've been playing, well, if I'm being honest, this week has been spent preparing for my next couple of bigger videos. So instead of talking about those titles, I'm going to look back on a relatively recent game that I would rather draw attention to.
Papers, Please is definitely a weirder beast. When you write down the concept, it seems like it would be one of the most monotonous and boring pieces of electronic garbage on the face of the planet. It's essentially a bureaucracy em up. You play an unnamed citizen of a totalitarian communist nation, and the game starts with you winning the work lottery and being appointed to a job as a border checkpoint passport and paperwork inspector. Once you receive control, you're given instructions to just verify certain criteria on passports. As the game continues, the instructions increase in complexity. You start having to verify every single piece of information on multiple sheets of paperwork, and if any discrepancy pops up, you either have to turn away the individual, or if certain criteria are met, the people come and get detained. Soon it extends even farther, running identity checks through fingerprinting, and even scanning and photographing for contraband. It becomes fairly intricate, but the thing that makes this incredibly engaging, or stressful depending on your perspective, is that you are operating on a time limit and can only process so many individuals in a day. Not only that, but you get paid for each accurate one, and being a rather impoverished nation rampant with corruption, under the best scenarios, you bring home maybe a little bit of extra in order to feed and shelter your family. Additionally, there's somehow a secondary screening process that calls you out if you let people through accidentally or otherwise, or erroneously turn them away. Given the investment I eventually placed in trying to ensure that my family could maintain food and shelter, it's hard to describe the anguish that I could feel whenever the notice went off saying that I made a mistake with my processing. Now, if your goal is simply to survive, you might be wondering, why would I intentionally let through people when I have no benefit? Well, most scenarios allow you to have one mistake per day without experiencing significant penalty. And the part that makes this game so worth talking about is the narrative that unfolds in front of you through the faces coming in and out of your checkpoint building. Minor story spoilers ahead. Nothing egregious, but you've been warned, and quite frankly, I wouldn't care either way, because it's about the journey. Your first few days go well, but all of a sudden the day is cut short when a terrorist attack takes place at the border, and as such, your shift is prematurely ended, causing you to have to tap into your very limited savings in order to make sure your family can live. Other scenarios start to transpire as well. A husband relates to you that their recently married wife is on the other side of the border, but the wife's paperwork is not in order. Do you allow her by and become merely a small point in their happily ever after, or do you separate the lovers in order to make sure you and your family are cared for? Other scenarios soon arise, such as the border guard that gives you a bonus by detaining more people with egregious errors, but I was doing that anyways as part of my job, so it was a win-win. Or the exotic dancer that you save from a human trafficker by remembering the description she gave and detaining him when the opportunity pops up. There's even one particular character you see repeatedly, Georgi Kostava. This guy is seemingly a lovable oaf, sloppily making assorted documents in order to try and enter the country, but he's never angry at you when you turn him away, until eventually he has the correct paperwork and you let him in. This was a whole saga in and of itself. And under one specific story ending, he ended up saving my ass by putting me in connection with people that could give me the proper resources in order to flee the country right before the government was about to take me. But if you thought this was just a tale of moral choices on an individual level, then you are sadly mistaken. Eventually, depending on choices you've made, you may be approached by members of an underground resistance group attempting to remove the current regime and bring about revolution for the benefit of the citizenry. Let me say this again. This is a game where the primary means of interaction with your environment is processing paperwork. When I heard about this, I was so intrigued by the concept of a game with such a mundane premise being able to realize such a compelling narrative, and you know what? Consider me convinced. This is the game that put the developer, Lucas Pope, on my radar, who I now look forward to seeing what else he can create. I know he's also done Return to the Obra Dinn, and I played that one as well. It was also fairly compelling, but it didn't grab me to the same degree. But anyway, back to Papers, Please. It's available on Steam for relatively cheap. However, if you're a hopeless mutant like me and you have to have a physical incarnation for some system, there is a PlayStation Vita version from Limited Run. It's probably one of the few systems that would be able to utilize it effectively because the Vita benefits tremendously from a touchscreen interface. I bet the Switch could also probably handle it easily, but now I'm getting distracted. Papers, Please is unlike a vast majority of big-budget games in the sheer unmarketability of its premise, which is unfortunate because if you are open to the idea, then there is a very compelling game here with, last I checked, over a dozen different potential endings based on your choices. I'm not going to go any further, though. If I haven't convinced you by now, then I'm probably not going to. I think Papers, Please is great, and for a guy who normally hates doing paperwork to praise a paperwork simulator, you know it has to be doing something right. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to get back to work on some of my bigger upcoming projects. This week, I've been playing the Dragon Ball Z Budokai Collection on PlayStation 3. I was initially planning on playing Temtem, which just came out for consoles. The package seemed promising, being an off-brand version of Pokemon and an MMO. I may still do that, but unfortunately GameStop corporate heads have been continuing to make blisteringly stupid decisions other than just selling NFTs of 9/11. I got some background information saying that they made significant revamps to their distribution methods, but in the process basically screwed over anyone who wanted a pre-order for certain titles for about a month. So I only acquired it a couple of days ago. However, after utterly failing to grasp JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, I decided to go back to one of the few fighting game series that I was able to have any degree of competence with. The Dragon Ball Z Budokai Collection on PlayStation 3, also available on 360, is essentially just a port compilation of the first and third games in the series. I'm docking points for not including 2. I genuinely love goofy fusions like Tiencha and Gokul, but whatever. Obviously, the single-player campaign follows the Dragon Ball Z anime of the same name. Believe it or not, I've never actually seen the entirety of the anime. Pretty much all of my experience and familiarity with the basic arcs initially came from these games, which may be preferable because I've never had to deal with filler. The single-player campaigns for both games follow Goku, Vegeta, and the other Z fighters through their battles, although Budokai 1 only goes up through the Cell Saga, which is far from the end of the series. Budokai 3, on the other hand, includes parts of Dragon Ball GT, which I know can be polarizing for fans, so take that for what you will. Now, let's take a minute to dissect the nuts and bolts and dive into one key question someone might have. Why did this game manage to hook me while so many other fighting games failed to do so? If you'll allow me to speculate, the fighting mechanics were well designed and based around a standard gaming controller, as opposed to traditional arcade 2D fighters, which were based around an oversized fight stick arrangement. Going into detail, Budokai games have a relatively basic control style which I think is rather easy to grasp. On PlayStation, square is to punch, triangle is to kick, circle is to implement an energy attack, and X is to initiate defensive maneuvers. The punch and kick buttons can be slightly modified by pressing the forward or back direction at the same time as an individual punch or kick press, and by simply repetitively pressing those buttons, you activate combos. The game also starts off very easy by only giving you the most basic of combos to initiate special moves. I've always found other fighters rather convoluted with things like quickly move the joystick back and forward then press light punch, or quarter turn plus 2 specific buttons then one other. They also usually drop all those combos on you at the very start, causing new players to be overwhelmed. The Budokai games were very good at pacing out their more advanced mechanics and allowing you to pick them up naturally, in addition to having AI that fluctuated much more naturally with the learning curve initiated by the fighting mechanics. If I had to have some complaints with the individual games in this collection, they would be as follows. The original Budokai seems like a base-level product with very little beyond a minimum shippable product. Even the graphics seem archaic with what came later. Not only that, but the fighting mechanics are lacking certain nuances that lead to significant frustration that was eliminated by subsequent titles. There was still plenty of subtle complexity to give you an edge in a fight, but there was also very little to counter or turn a match around if you had a bit of bad luck at the start. A complaint I have with both games is the degree with which I have to grind to unlock all content. Especially the first Budokai, which was particularly egregious, with every single skill having to be unlocked 9 times in order to complete the game. As for an individual complaint with Budokai 3, the only one I can really conceive of, which is a complaint unique to the compilation, is that they replaced the intro song from the PlayStation 2 version, which I thought was good enough to warrant playing every time I turned on the game. From what I understand, there was a bit of accusation of plagiarism from the composer when it came to making certain songs, but that doesn't change the fact that I thought the song was a banger. In one final side note, I threw some shade last week on the Tenkaichi series, and I'll quickly summarize my feelings as follows. The Tenkaichi series was worse because they sacrificed fighting mechanics for movement mechanics in Spectacle, and the game suffered as a result. To me, the only place where it was better was by the end, where they had such an expansive roster where you could play as such a wide spectrum of extras, such as Frieza Minion number 3. When they start including so many characters that are only different on a skin level, you can see that they weren't giving the mechanics quite so much thought. So there you have it, a brief dissection of one of the few fighting games I ever cared to get good at, and why I like it. Now if you'll excuse me, since I have that copy of Temtem, I'm gonna go give that a shot. Vampire Survivors on Steam was recommended me not once, but twice. Once from a coworker just engaging in casual conversation, and another from a friend that I sometimes play online shooters with. Isn't that right, Plinko?
Don't put me in the video.
Okay! The way Vampire Survivors was best described to me, and the way that I best agree summarizes it, is something of a reverse bullet hell shooter. You start as one of the selection of characters from the Castlevania template that you unlock and are dropped into a wide open map with an automatically performed attack that you have to try and make sure lines up so that you can take out enemies. Those enemies then drop experience orbs so you can level up, gain new abilities, and attacks, and become more competent at the ability to destroy those around you. It's an inordinately simple concept, but I'll be damned if it's not absorbing. And the flashing effects and colors of fully level attack abilities are strangely hypnotizing. Don't think you're going to have an easy time of it, though. The weapons, abilities, and power-ups that you get access to are randomized, and you can be entirely screwed over by bad luck at the draw. This ensures that almost no playthrough is exactly the same. And on a standard playthrough, the goal is simply to survive to the 30-minute mark, at which point you win and the Grim Reaper comes to claim your soul. Theoretically, you can also kill the Grim Reaper, but I have yet to do so. In addition, the selection of unlockable characters and their respective abilities can go a long way to influencing your survivability. Garlic Grandpa is my personal favorite. I like my personal space! It can also get rather hilarious because near the end of a run, provided you've gotten all your upgrades distributed correctly, you're basically an unstoppable force where no bad guys can touch you so long as you don't move. So the swirling mass of snarling teeth and swinging claws flail just out of reach while you desperately wait for the clock to finish the countdown so that you can see what you unlock and get ready for the next run. All in all, a simple premise, pixelated visuals, visceral effects, and quick-hit fun capability for this title left me far more satisfied. Sorry, but not sorry to any fighting game fans. Although if someone does want to reach out to me and drag me kicking and screaming to the promised land of people that are really good at talking trash and then smashing fighting sticks into the floor at public tournaments, I may not say no. This week I've been playing Hot Wheels Unleashed. Geez, now that I think about it, I have been playing a lot of arcade racers lately, haven't I? Whatever, that just means I can forego my usual format of explaining why I like the genre overall. Yes, it's another arcade racing game, but this one is unique in that it actually managed to garner some interest from me before it actually released. You see, I make it a priority not to fall into the trap of video game hype-mongering. I find that it's much more useful in life to be a cynic. Don't get me wrong, there are franchises that I love, thoroughly enjoy, and eagerly anticipate new entries of... Alright, scratch that last part. Long story short, a game has to do a lot of stuff right in its marketing phase in order to even have me raise an eyebrow. Hot Wheels Unleashed checked a good portion of those boxes. In preview and pre-release marketing events, they showed off gameplay. The mechanics were solidly displayed, there was enough detail in what was shown to make me think the developers were actually treating this with respect, and the publisher was seemingly giving enough time to turn out something with quality. Lo and behold, all those expectations have actually been communicated through the released title. For the most part anyways, but I'll get into that later. Hot Wheels Unleashed is a mechanically deep, easy-to-learn, fun-to-master racing title with a wealth of detail that shows love and passion for the source material. In this case, die-cast metal model cars that are best known as having a co-starring role as a minor combatant in Home Alone. And speaking of Home Alone and the fear of damage that unintended children can cause, it's worth noting I don't have kids. But if I did, I'd imagine this would be an excellent title for them to have fun with as well. The wide variety of colorful cars and variable difficulty levels are likely to ensure fun at all ages. Although for some minor nitpicks, I don't appreciate how some cars have adopted the rubber banding tendency of ignoring their in-game stats just for the sake of griefing you, and cutting out in front of you on a turn that they should have no rights being able to navigate. But nevertheless, it is amusing to see the wide variety of cars on display, from the pop culturally iconic to the speed demon machines that will undoubtedly dominate multiplayer matches, to the trash stat comedy vehicles themed around dinosaurs and food items. I'd imagine that the scenarios in this game are likely what flashed through the mind of a 6-year-old guillotine as he set up tracks and raced his cars around his parents' basement. And that transitions nicely to the environments, because there are a few worth noting, such as a basement, a skate park, a garage, and a couple others. It makes for interesting and varied track layouts with courses weaving through air ducts and around equipment or furniture. And if the courses don't seem interesting enough, you can create your own. Having given the course editor a quick try, I can tell that it's fairly in-depth and not something you can just immediately dive into. But that being said, I can imagine that with a little effort, the community is going to create some amazing tracks, and I may even dive into it if I can get familiar enough with the track editors and maintain some passion. And speaking of passion, it's clearly shown through the details that the developers held the Hot Wheels license with reverence, as every single car is intricately crafted with the smallest touches in the molded plastic and model numbers even being depicted on the underside of your cars as they would be if you were holding the toy in your hand. I even noticed that on some of the time trials that I spent a little bit more effort on to shave seconds, it led to the model garnering wear and tear as any owner of a Hot Wheels toy that they played with extensively would be familiar with. All these little additions don't really impact gameplay, but the fact that they are included shows they had enough time to craft a solid experience with lots to appreciate. And speaking of things that I appreciate, let's go to something I mentioned in my last racing game review. Maintaining the trend, there isn't really a story mode. The campaign is literally racing challenges set up on a map navigation menu. Mechanically speaking, absolutely unnecessary, but given the childlike nature of the IP, it doesn't seem like it would be a terrible stretch to set up something with the impetus being a kid's imagination to fuel an actual story in the levels. Remember, I'm a hopeless mutant who appreciates story whenever it's included and well done. One thing I don't appreciate, however, is the abundance of stability issues that I encountered. To explain my specific setup, I was playing the PlayStation 4 version on a PlayStation 5. It made more sense to me because many titles are featuring free, if not relatively inexpensive, upgrades from one system to another, and a title that can be played on two systems as opposed to one seems like a clear upside. It's just unfortunate that when the game got hectic, I had about a 1 in 4 chance of having the game crash on me, and on boss levels that ratio might as well have gone up to a 50% chance that the game was going to crash at some point throughout the race. It becomes particularly infuriating when I'm working on a course that I've had to try a couple times and I'm finally having a good run, only to initiate a drift or a turbo boost and suddenly the game locks up and I'm met with an error screen. I'm 100% serious when I say that I have lost count of the number of times that I had to send this error report. If anyone who has played this on one of the other systems has had a similar experience on the systems they were specifically made for, please let me know. I'm sure this can be patched or updated, but if I base my purchase decisions around things like backwards compatibility and then it shows to be unstable, it's something that deserves to be called out. For the love of God, Milestone, patch this. And to conclude, speaking of things that deserve to be called out, I am incredibly worried for this game on one element. It is so preemptively set up for microtransactions with a loot box style reward system that it scares me. At the time of writing, the game allows for you to unlock cars via specific purchases or loot boxes using in-game currency that can only be attained by playing the game. But as I said, it's so preemptively set up to have paid for microtransactions for this loot box system that it could theoretically be as simple as modifying a piece of code from allow_microtransactions_ and switching the status from 1 to a 0. This game is also already set up with multiple season passes for additional content, which I do not appreciate, but it's kind of hard to escape in this day and age. Not that I think it's excusable. On the other hand, the game isn't toting the usual new price point of $70 or even $60. For a new release to come in at $50, it does raise an eyebrow, but I suppose they're using that as an excuse to include multiple season passes. That. Let me be clear on one thing though. If this game, literally oriented with an intellectual property towards children, switches this game to allow a gambling mechanic tied to paid microtransactions, I am going to crucify this game in an update video, and any recommendation I give here will be 100% retracted.
This is the sonorous war cry of a very angry frog.
I remain hopeful because the developer and publisher, Milestone, did not seem to be frequently using that business model with the brief research I conducted. Now, on these quicker reviews, I've basically established that I don't give number scores, but a level of recommendation, and at this time, I kind of do recommend this one. The stability issues are unfortunate, but as I said, likely to be patched, and the rest of the experience is solid and drips with style and passion that can be appreciated by anyone that's ever played with the 1/64th scale toys that they're based on. Just beware the potential for future monetization changes.